Chapter 204. Shula was silent, but that didn't mean he was dull. Shula was always smiling, but that didn't mean he was heartless. The environment he grew up in and his education background made it impossible for him to fully understand some methods of using people. Even if he understood, it might be difficult for him to do it with his temperament. So, since escaping from the Eastwood region, he had not had a single partner or helper except for a few friends who shared the same bad habits but ended up with bad endings because of this stubborn stench. Of course, it was a bit harsh to ask an orphan who had just turned 20 years old to suddenly become a powerful child of power. However, as an orphan who had been living in Bell Tower Street for several years, Shula was able to safely pass his adolescence. Apart from Uncle Feng Yu's care, Shula's ability to observe people's expressions wasn't bad. In the words of that uncle, this kid seemed to have a natural ability to discern people's hearts. Shula was able to figure out what the people around him wanted in a very short time. For example, Li Wei wanted respect, so he wanted power and fists. For example, Zhong Xiaoming wanted to follow in the footsteps of that old bastard, St. George. She wanted to take advantage of her youth and childishness to do the right thing, then turn into a sky full of fireworks, regardless of other people's tears. For example, Shi Qinghai wanted peace, but because of that director's leap, it became a bubble. Secretary Bai Yulon needed money. Although he didn't know where his urgent desire for money came from that night's car race on the old road of Shoujing Expressway, it could be seen that this delicate man was willing to give up his life for money. His behavior after the event also proved that this person respected money very much. The organizational structure of the Whitewater Company was somewhat similar to the military structure, but there were also some very different aspects. The most different aspect was reflected in the power of the technical director. The company's combat personnel undertook the task of testing new weapons for the federal military, guarding engineering spaceships on peripheral planets, or carrying out some dark missions for the Federation government. The performance of the new weapons in these battles indirectly determined the time series when the new weapons officially entered the Federal Army's standard equipment. The technical supervisor assigned to the combat team also had more power because of this background. After all, the experimental data of the new weapon and the tracking monitoring needed to be controlled by these technical supervisors. The technicians who were sent to the Whitewater Company from the Research Institute or the Engineering Department were undoubtedly sent away, but they had extremely high authority in their respective teams, just like Shula. Team 7, which Shula belonged to, was a little different from the other combat teams. This was because they were now part of the Security Consultant Department. This department was the most peripheral and least valued department in Whitewater Security Company. It was specifically responsible for the comprehensive planning of the personal safety of some of the influential figures in the Federation. In short, it was bodyguards. The first time he met Secretary Bai, Shula knew that the other party was not an ordinary person. The race that night had strengthened his confidence. Therefore, he did not understand why Team 7, which had a person like Bai Yulon, was not valued by the company. She was assigned to the Security Consulting Department and did not receive any business for half a year. Most importantly, Team 7 did not have a combat team leader. The highest-ranking officer was Shu Le, the technical director. This kind of personnel structure was strange. The dark armory was full of the smell of engine oil. The gradually setting sun could not shine into this forgotten corner. A week after entering the headquarters of the Whitewater Company, Shula found out that the underground of the headquarters, which looked like a farm, was actually a very large comprehensive base. The armory and the training ground were all underground. I used to be the leader of Team 7, but I committed a crime and was dismissed. However, the higher-ups also know that the guys in this team are not very obedient. It is useless to send a new leader. Bai Yulon was leaning against a scrapped self-propelled vehicle. Her delicate hands were in her purse, and there was a hint of coldness between her delicate eyebrows. However, the smell of engine oil in the armory and the scattered weapons and equipment made her look different from her usual self. She was like a decadent artistic youth who suddenly stood beside an oil brush. She no longer looked like a lady, but started to look like a real soldier. She was like a decadent artistic youth who suddenly stood beside an oil brush. This was Team 7's exclusive armory. The weapons and equipment inside looked to be in good condition, but they had not been maintained for a long time. No one knew how long they could last on the battlefield. Shula lay on the skateboard and looked at the internal structure of the self-propelled missile through his goggles. He was sure that if this weapon was transported to a mineral star to fight, it would only need to fire 2 shots before it would fall apart. Bai Yulon's gaze was a little cold, and there was a trace of loneliness hidden in that coldness. She looked at the 2 legs that extended out from under the self-propelled gun, and her heart trembled slightly. She thought to herself that if this gun were to collapse at this moment, the person below would probably die more thoroughly. I don't know who you offended and who sent you to Team 7, but since you are here, I am afraid you will not be able to get out. Shula was still under the self-propelled missile. I can take on private jobs, but I don't do things that are illegal, said Bai Yulon lightly, his tone incomparably calm and harmless. At this time, Shula already understood Secretary Shen's arrangement. Back when Morcho had been negotiating at the back of the mountain terrace, he had suggested that he wanted to observe the development of the new mecha from the closest distance. However, he couldn't show his face in the engineering department, so the other side had actually chosen such an unexpected method to send him to the side of the few people in the Federation who had personally operated the new generation MX mecha. Of course it's not illegal, said Shula. It's something personal. Personal matters are often troublesome matters. Bai Yulon lowered his eyes and looked at Shula's hand that was covered in the color of detergent. He said slowly, I can sell my life for money, but I also want to sell it clearly. That delicate pair of hands pulled out of his pocket, a military knife in his right hand. Bai Yulon said in a low voice, but if you want our team, then this isn't a matter of money. I can't let a young spoiled brat like you drag all 30 of us into a pit. Shula looked at the delicate military knife in his delicate hand and said, slightly taken aback, what do you want to do? Actually, if this sentence had been said by the delicate Bai Yulon, perhaps the scene would have been better. But Bai Yulon only smiled and walked over to him, saying, if you want to buy Team 7, then at least let me see your true strength. If you're not strong enough, how can you have the right to make such a request? Shula was speechless. He still couldn't completely understand the logic of certain people, such as the logic of these Federation soldiers. He looked at the delicate man walking over with the delicate military knife, and could only clench his fists. Chapter 205. I have a nickname, it's called Magnolia Oil. Bai Magnolia said in a soft voice. That delicate military knife danced between his delicate fingers. The cold light was like a firefly, piercing through the air silently. I joined the army when I was 15 years old. After 10 years of fighting, I know how to operate 134 types of equipment. So in the army, they all think that I'm a veteran. Bai Magnolia's voice was still very gentle. He was reminding Shula of something. After all, the other party was the technical supervisor in name. He couldn't really stab him. But there were rules in the army. Even though the 7th team was exiled to the farm headquarters at the edge of the concrete forest, they still had to follow their rules. Bai Magnolia also felt that this young civilian second lieutenant in front of him was a bit strange. He wanted to know more about him. Shula narrowed his eyes and stared at the delicate military knife in Bai Yulon's hand that danced like a black elf. He didn't know when Bai Yulon had it in his hand. Listening to these indifferent words, he didn't have any intense emotions. His 2 feet slowly moved away from the cement floor, and the soles of his feet were firmly on the ground. He tilted his head and took a deep breath. His legs quickly shook, shaking up a few strands of dust on the ground. With an incredible speed, he pushed his whole body towards Bai Magnolia. The trembling of his legs was actually because he was moving very fast. It was just that he was moving so fast that it was somewhat dazzling. With a swoosh, the delicate military knife in Bai Magnolia's hand slashed down diagonally. It turned into a stream of light and for the first time, made a terrifying sound. At the same time, Bai Magnolia's pupils shrank. The tip of his leather shoes touched the ground. His whole body arched and he quickly retreated. He knew that Shula, the technical supervisor, had some problems, so he had to test the other party today. However, he did not expect the other party to move at such a fast speed. More importantly, This speed was accompanied by an imposing aura. By Magnolia suddenly felt the danger that could only be felt on the battlefield. Without saying anything, he slashed forward with his arm, but his body retreated swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Shula's body seemed to be dodging instinctively. When he started, his legs moved quickly, but his upper body was abnormally stable. At this time, when he rushed in front of By Magnolia, his legs seemed to have grown roots. His upper body began to accurately and effectively dodge in a small area. The delicate military knife in Bai Yulon's hand flashed like lightning in the dark space of the armory, appearing and disappearing at the same time. His delicate hands seemed to have some kind of magical power that allowed him to play with an ordinary military knife in his hands, playing with it until it reached a certain realm. With a swoosh, Shula's clothes were cut open on his shoulder. His body crashed into By Magnolia's arms. His left hand blocked By Magnolia's upper body. Then, with a sneaky second thrust, his right hand went straight for By Magnolia's neck. By Magnolia cried out in a low voice. His right wrist twisted and went under Shula's left arm. The military knife shone with a cold light. It trembled and emitted a very thin light. It was about to go under Shula's ear. This move was indescribably fast and ruthless. At the beginning, they did not want to fight to the death. However, By Magnolia's military knife was too cold and dangerous. Shula had been silent the whole time, but when he attacked, he did not show any mercy. When the two collided, they knew that neither of them were good people. Although they did not fight to the point of anger, at this critical moment, they both felt a chill. Neither of them dared to slow down. Shula looked at the cold light floating under his chin. His eyes narrowed. He flipped his left wrist and threw it out. It was the ugliest move of the 10 moves that Uncle had taught him. It was like a singer swinging his long sleeves, or a shrew trying to break free from her cowardly husband's hand. Although it was a little ugly, it was absolutely effective. His left arm, which was as hard as iron, directly hit By Magnolia's right wrist, making a loud pa sound. By Magnolia did not groan. His face was pale. He kicked towards Shula's lower abdomen. His right hand, which had been thrown into the air, chopped towards Shula's forehead. It was as if he wanted to use the cold light to cut Shula's straight eyebrows into a few inches of dry twigs. Shula did not pay attention to the military knife coming towards his head. His feet scraped against the ground, and his body moved closer to the retreating By Magnolia. In an extremely short period of time, his left and right hands were like 2 sand hammers, striking towards his opponent's chest. Bam, 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 bam. A series of muffled sounds rang out. By Magnolia's left hand was unable to block the 2 lightning-fast fists. With a muffled groan, the cold light flashed again. He lowered his head, pursed his lips, and a murderous look flashed across his delicate face. With a swish, the cold light on his right hand drew the word 1 in front of him. At the end of the stroke of the last word, the sharp tip of the military knife silently arrived an inch away from Shula's carotid artery. It was as if a waterfall of blood could come out at any time. Magnolia's nickname in the military was Magnolia Oil. It wasn't just because he was young, but he was already a seasoned veteran. It was also because his former colleagues in the Federation's military were all very clear about the coldness of this delicate man who killed without batting an eyelid, and how slippery the delicate military knife in his hand was. Often, during close combat, the opponent would only notice the eye-catching cold glint in his eyes, but would die under the silent sneak attack of the delicate military knife. When the military knife cut open the carotid artery, the opponent's blood would spray onto his face. It could also spray onto the ceiling like a reverse waterfall. By Magnolia had killed countless people over the years. He didn't know how many enemies he had seen die just like that in front of him. He was a little numb to this kind of waterfall of blood. However, today, he didn't want to kill Shula, but because of this inexplicable sense of danger, he used his killer move. His right index finger trembled slightly. He was ready to place the military knife on the opponent's weak neck and make the opponent admit defeat. However, at this moment, Shula's shoulder suddenly rose. His right arm came from the outside and smashed horizontally. A heavy muffled sound echoed in the dark armory. By Magnolia lowered his head. His delicate brows were furrowed. He stood calmly. The military knife in his right hand was slightly stained with blood. His right leg was trembling non-stop. Shula stood in front of him. There were 7 or 8 slender cuts on his clothes. Only the cut on his shoulder was slowly oozing blood. Magnolia raised his head and said softly, "What did you eat when you were growing up?" Shula was stunned. He said, "Beef." Magnolia smiled self-deprecatingly. His fingers twirled a flower, and he put the military knife back into the hidden sheath at his waist. He turned around and walked out of the armory. Shula's last attack had been too powerful. His left arm, which was blocking the side of his face, felt like it was about to break. His right leg, which was supporting him and not falling down, began to tremble. Sweat seeped out of Shula's hair and dripped onto the wound on his shoulder. Shula looked down and couldn't help but shake his head. Magnolia's attack was indeed cunning and ruthless. If his reaction had been just a bit slower, that military knife would have slit his throat. He just felt a little confused. He fought for no reason and got injured, but he didn't really beat the other party into submission. Could this be the way the Federation's soldiers did things? Shula thought to himself. Luckily, he was just a civilian soldier. At the end of the corridor in the Army General Hospital, the glass window was opened. The late spring scent of the garden downstairs seeped in. Shula lit a cigarette and smoked in silence. Yulon was leaning against the wall of the corridor with his hands folded in his sleeves, silently looking at the scenery outside the window. His facial features were delicate and his expression was serene. Unfortunately, the bruise on his left cheek and his trembling thigh ruined this picture. Shula handed him a cigarette. Magnolia didn't shake his head or accept it. Shula squatted down and continued to smoke his cigarette. Thinking of the people he saw in the intensive care unit, his mood became heavy. Magnolia's family was in the intensive care unit. Magnolia was born on planet S2. His parents both worked in the Federation's heavy manufacturing factory. Because of a leak accident, they were poisoned and laid in the hospital. Before we came, I told you that this is a very tacky story. Magnolia looked coldly at the treetops swaying in the spring breeze outside the window. The Federation's government provides medical compensation. It's enough for my parents to lie in the hospital bed until they die of natural exhaustion. But I want them to stay in the best ward. I also hired 6 special nurses, so there's a lot of spending. Shula squatted in front of him and used his hand to wipe away the fine bloodstains on his shoulder. The company's salary and benefits have always been good. Plus, you still have a military salary to take. There's really no need for you to take on any private jobs. In the middle of an important mission for the Experimental Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha, the combat supervisor of Team 7 beside him actually dared to take on private jobs. He didn't know whether to say that this delicate man valued money more than his life, or that he was too filial. This has nothing to do with filial piety. Magnolia said coldly, I just like money. I also want to live the best life. I want to wear branded clothes, drive branded sports cars, and sleep with the best women. All of this needs money. Shula was silent. He really didn't know what kind of person Magnolia was. At this time, a nurse walked over. Seeing Shula smoking, she loudly reprimanded him. Shula stood up unabashedly and apologized profusely. He extinguished the cigarette with the tip of his foot. Unable to find the dustbin, he could only pinch the cigarette between his fingers. Magnolia looked quietly at his fingertips. Looking at the extinguished cigarette, he suddenly said, What exactly do you want me to do? Shula took out a bank card from his pocket. It was the one Li Xiaotong had prepared for him. Handing it over, he said, There's 20 million in the card. Magnolia was silent for a long time. He was probably shocked by this number. He could be considered a high-income person in the Federation. Adding in the private jobs he had taken on over the years, and the 1.2 million check Shula had given him in the afternoon, he had about 5 million in savings. However, his attitude towards money had always been extremely respectful, the more, the better. He took the light yet heavy bank card and said calmly, Deal. Magnolia didn't ask Shula what he wanted him to do. For a moment, Shula didn't understand what deal meant. Only after a long while did he come to his senses. His eyes gradually narrowed. He understood that this oddly delicate man was saying that he would sell his life to him. Chapter 206. Shula used to be very poor. In the first 2 years after he became an orphan, he only ate with Xiaoqiong's mother for 2 years. Because of some unknown reason, perhaps because of his innate self-esteem or inferiority complex, he moved out and applied for government aid. He officially joined Li Wei's group of orphans to shop on the streets. He learned a lot from Uncle Fengyu, but that stingy boss did not have the habit of giving him a salary. He only left behind a bank card after his death. It was from that bank card that Shula could be considered to have stepped into the stage of a rich person. His poor childhood did not distort his concept of money. Instead, he increasingly felt that money was just a tool. It was not a goal to strive for. This was not like a lotus flower growing in the mud, but a rock in Donglin, no matter how long it soaked in the latrine, would still be hard. The stench attached to it would disappear after being washed away by clean water. Because of this concept, the bank card that Uncle Feng left him contained enough money for a normal person to live a normal life. In just a short year, he spent almost all of it. He secretly transferred 1 million to Li Wei, who was far away in Donglin, through the black market. He bought a set of antique simulation equipment from the Shell Motor Company, bought some components, bought flowers, porridge, and biscuits for Zhong Xiaomeng, and bought pancakes, porridge, and women for Tai Jiyuan. How much was left? After leaving Yue University, he started to receive a salary from the Shell Motor Company. He received the riskiest investment in his life from the Li family's 7th young master. Suddenly, Shula became a young multimillionaire. Then, he gave away this multimillionaire. Although he did not value money, it did not mean that he did not understand the magic of money in the Federation. That was why he gave the bank card to Bai Yulon. But after that, he realized that he still did not understand Bai Yulon. Could it be that money could really buy a person's life? Ever since the battle at the armory, Bai Magnolia had returned to her usual self. She spoke very little, but she had begun to truly fulfill her duties as a secretary. In fact, she was even better than a full-time secretary. As long as Shula did not express any objections, she would stand behind him like a shadow and help him deal with all the complicated matters. He was like a secretary, but also like a bodyguard. However, Bai Yulon did not have much respect for him. She just treated this as a very boring job. Shula was not used to Bai Yulon's change, but he had to admit that things were much smoother with Bai Yulon's help. For example, today, when Shula decided to take advantage of the 4-day summer holiday in the Federation to rush to Harbor City, Bai Yulon immediately bought a train ticket that was very popular. The people who were on holiday on the train passed through the self-propelled track on the platform and waved goodbye to their relatives and friends on the upper floors with smiles on their faces. Shula retracted his gaze from the window and looked at the serene Bai Yulon in front of him. His emotions could not help but become somewhat complicated. Using Li Xiaotong's investment, he had purchased many of the components that Shula needed. Right now, the simulation system that he had privately modified was gradually becoming a prototype. Besides this important task, Shula had originally wanted to use the data and functional formulas in his head, as well as the design progress of the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department. Perhaps he would be able to solve the problem of the new generation of mecha in the Federation one step ahead. However, when he truly began to come into contact with this field, Shula found that he was just daydreaming. In the post-interstellar era where crystal mines were gradually depleted, space travel, which was very common in the early days of the constitutional era, began to become extremely expensive and luxurious. In this universe composed of galaxies, not every citizen of the Federation had access to advanced technology such as mechas, battleships, and spaceships. Not everyone could freely travel between the stars. Even the citizens who were born in the 2 recent constitutional era had never left the planet they belonged to. They just silently worked at their respective posts. Other than watching the real-time images taken by the spaceship on Channel 10 or watching the cute purple-haired colonel on Channel 23 lead the Enterprise through the stars, the most likely way for a normal citizen of the Federation to truly set foot in the universe was to join the military. Or rather, it was to voluntarily sign up for the excavation department of a mining company. They would go to remote resource planets to operate machines that did not speak and spend a long and lonely time there. However, the people of the Federation always had a way to solve these mental needs. Since the constitutional era, high-speed rail transit across the surface of the planet had become the most retro and satisfying form of transportation in the writings of writers. That was why Shula could see such a busy station. The maximum speed of the high-speed rail had now reached 800 km per hour. There was no problem in using it to maintain the transportation of the entire planet's surface. Although it was still much slower than flying through the clouds, the ticket price was correspondingly much cheaper. Why was the high-speed rail paved with dense magnetic material called the high-speed rail? This was a question that required archaeology. It was said that it was a saying before the catastrophe. Since there was no historical material, no historians were willing to get to the bottom of it. Accompanied by a soft electronic sound, the station and buildings outside the window began to speed up and recede. The radio noise during the startup phase made some passengers who were riding the high-speed rail for the first time find that their portable tablet computer had no wireless signal, and they could not help but complain. Shula looked at Bai Yulon again and then looked out of the window again. He looked at the rows of broad-leaved trees in the streets of the capital special district, which quickly flashed past his eyes. Bai Yulon, who was sitting opposite him, took off her headphones and looked at the young man by the window. As a veteran who had been in the military for 10 years, his gentleness and calmness was not only an effective disguise, but also a way for him to find inner peace. However, looking at Shula's ordinary face, Bai Yulon's heart was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. The 7th Combat Group of the Whitewater Company, which he led, was now in its most difficult period because of the serious mistake they made in the Bermuda Triangle Star region last autumn. Except for him, the members of the group were either sent back to their respective military districts for confinement or were on unpaid leave. He was the only one who remained at the company headquarters calmly. It was difficult to lead a team when the people's hearts were broken. However, if the people's hearts were still there, and the team was gone, there was no need to say anything. After the fight in the armory, Bai Yulon confirmed that this new young technical director might be a little immature, but he was very scary. He knew that he had held back that day, but the problem was that his opponent must have held back as well. Bai Yulon could not even distinguish Shula's techniques. She only felt that his close combat style was somewhat similar to a certain technique promoted by the special forces in the military a few years ago, except that it was more direct and more ruthless. In addition to his combat strength, Shula's performance in the next few days also surprised Bai Yulon. This young technical director used a jaw-dropping speed to repair all the equipment in the 7th Combat Group's armory. He even repaired a few large pieces of equipment that were damaged. When Bai Yulon was at the front lines in the Westwoods, she had seen many excellent mechanical engineers who were treasured by the military officers. However, she had never seen anyone who could discover problems, judge problems, and solve problems faster than Shula. The young man opposite her seemed to have a natural instinct for metal-related mechanical equipment. This should be some kind of talent that could not be replicated. Bai Yulon really could not understand. What kind of medicine did those big shots in the Nutshell Mobile headquarters eat wrong? They actually threw such a genius mechanic into their own Team 7. Unlimited potential, full combat strength, and a lot of money. He was generous like an idiot. His background was mysterious but definitely not simple. Working for such a person was actually not a bad choice. It should be known that in the current Federation, it was not so easy to earn money. As Bai Yulon thought about this, she stood up and made a cup of tea for Shula. She was an excellent person who did what she was paid. Since she had received 20 million, she did not mind making Shula's bed and folding his blanket. The high-quality green tea floated gently in the glass and then slowly sank like a spring fog, dyeing the clear water around it. Shula turned around and looked at the green tea in the cup. He was slightly stunned. He wondered if Bai Yulon wanted to steal the orderly's job as well. "I'll go to the dining car and bring dinner over," Bai Yulon said softly and then walked out of the room. Shula had never been served like this in his life, so it was inevitable that he was not used to it. Bai Yulon walked out of the room and brushed past 2 youthful girls. Her delicate eyebrows furrowed. The two girls walked to a private room at the side. One of the girls looked a little lonely. In this spring weather, she was wearing a dull black outfit. Meow meow, open your mind. The dead cannot be brought back. If Park Ji-ho was still alive, he would not want you to live such a sad life. Chapter 207. Meow meow, surname Meow. When her close friends or family members call her by her name, they would only think of the two words meow in their hearts. She was 20 years old this year. It was the season when meow sprouts were growing and swaying in the spring breeze. However, this bunch of meow sprouts were tall and straight. It was always pleasing and not eye-catching. She was now a student in Linhai University, and her other identity was Park Ji-ho's fiancé. The golden-haired Park Ji-ho, although his life was not smooth sailing, he met his nemesis, Shula, and stopped abruptly before he had the time to develop his grand plans. But in terms of luck, he was pretty lucky. Park Ji-ho and Meow Meow were family friends. Back then, they worked together in S3 and moved back to S1. According to the old rules, the two families arranged a marriage. Although it was not a terrifying family like the 7 major families, after all, it was still a foundation. Park Ji-ho didn't expect to be free to love. Moreover, Meow Meow was a docile and pleasant girl. Most of his thoughts were on his future, so the two got along well. After the tragedy on Hushan Road, Meow Meow, as Park Ji-ho's fiancé, naturally went to the capital special district. The funeral had just been arranged a few days ago, but the grief in the girl's heart couldn't be erased in such a short time. The elders of the two families were a little worried, so they simply asked for leave from school. Including the summer vacation, a total of 3 months, they let her go back to her hometown in S3 to relax. Today, in the high-speed train carriage, they were heading to the largest airport in Gwangju. Her fiancé had just passed away, so in this late spring, Meow Meow wore a dull black outfit. Her small face was not powdered, and there was a trace of sadness in her pale face. The girl who was traveling with her was called Nan Xiangmei. She was Meow Meow's good friend. They happened to meet in the special district, so they agreed to go to Gwangju together. His relatives might still be sad, and his fiancée might need to spend several years to get rid of this bad news. However, others didn't have so many thoughts. Although they didn't sing and dance together, Nan Xiangmei had never seen the rumored handsome blonde boy. Therefore, when she saw her female companion's sad expression, it was naturally difficult for her to sympathize with her. She could only quietly comfort her and ease her worries. Nan Xiangmei was definitely not a stunning girl. Her lush black hair was casually cut to the side of her ears. She was not as soft as the average long-haired beauty, nor was she as pretty as the short-haired girls. She was just calm, and her facial features also revealed a sense of calmness. If one looked at her carefully for a long time, one would be able to appreciate more and more of her beauty. Listening to Nan Xiangmei's comfort, Meow Meow forced a smile. But when she thought of her fiancé in the cemetery, her heart couldn't help but twitch. She and Park Ji-gao didn't meet much, but the two of them had the same thoughts. She knew what kind of lofty ambition the blonde man had. Unexpectedly, after 3 months, he passed away just like that. Meow Meow didn't know about Nan Xiangmei's family situation. At this age, no one would talk about their family background. But she knew that her friend's family shouldn't be short of money. And at this time, she was lonely and sad, so she was grateful to have her friend by her side to comfort her. Meow Meow looked at Nan Xiangmei's calm eyes. After hesitating for a moment, she remembered the news that her sister-in-law secretly told her. That news had been suppressed in her heart, and there was no one to ask. Now that she was comforted by her friend, the sadness and anger in her heart suddenly rushed out. She tightly pursed her lips and said, "There is a secret behind Jigao's death." Didn't the district prosecutor's office close the case? Nan Xiangmei was slightly surprised. She looked at her and said softly, "It's just a scapegoat." Meow Meow's face showed a trace of sadness. Jigao offended a big shot in the Federation, so he was killed. Nan Xiangmei quietly looked at her eyebrows and confirmed that her friend didn't start talking nonsense because of the death of her fiancé. She tilted her head and thought for a moment, then said, "Who told you?" "Park Ji-sung. The elders in the family were worried that I would think too much, so they kept it from me. Meow Meow sadly turned her head and looked at the mountains outside the car window that was covered with a layer of golden sunset. She thought that the sun would eventually rise tomorrow, but what about her lover? Nan Xiangmei softly sighed. After a moment of consideration, she was sure that it was inappropriate for her to say anything at this time. She had no choice but to ask, "Who is so vicious?" "I heard that it was a person who entered the nutshell with Jigao. He entered the research institute, but then disappeared." Meow Meow turned her head and sneered. Bai Yulon shrugged. She carried the tray through the passage and opened the door of the private room. She thought that the sound insulation of the luxurious soft sleeper private room on the high-speed rail was too poor. The two girls inside actually didn't know who to avoid when they talked about murder and arson. The luxurious soft sleeper private room occupied a large area. In addition to 2 comfortable beds, there was also a sofa and a few simple furnishings. Bai Yulon put the tray on the coffee table. She glanced at the big black box under the coffee table and looked at Shu Le. Shu Le nodded. Bai Yulon opened the big black box and pushed it under Shu Le's bed. When they left the capital, Shu Le always carried this big box with him. He didn't know what was in the box, but he knew that it was very heavy. She poured a glass of orange juice for Shu Le. Shu Le said thank you. Then the two people couldn't find anything to talk about and began to eat in silence. After the meal, Bai Yulon began to clean up the mess again. Shu Le was bored to death as she watched this delicate man busying himself in and out. For a moment, she couldn't help but have an illusion that she had spent 20 million yuan to buy a maid. How long will it take to get to Hong Kong? Shu Le watched the TV for a while and suddenly asked. Just now the broadcast said that there was a flash flood along the new Yuju. Although it didn't affect the line, it is estimated that it will take about 10 hours to get there because of the Federation's disaster relief train. Bai Yulon softly replied. Shu Le shook his head. The summer holiday was only 4 days. He had to secretly enter the Nutshell Engineering Department, so he could only use the holiday. Time was a little tight. If he didn't worry that the big black leather suitcase wouldn't pass the Federation's airport security check, he would never take the high-speed train. According to Bai Yulon, the luxury soft sleeper ticket was actually much more expensive than the plane ticket. Go one carriage in the A direction, there is a special bar. Bai Yulon said. Oh, since we have nothing to do, let's go walk around. Shu Le asked for his opinion. Bai Yulon had finished cleaning up and quietly replied, I don't have any opinion, but I want to remind you of one thing. Park Ji-ho's fiancé lives next door. Shu Le was stunned. He looked at Bai Yulon and gradually narrowed his eyes. The Hushan Road incident happened a long time ago. He knew that there were probably not many people in the White Water Company who knew about his relationship with that incident. Since Secretary Bai reminded him, he must know the inside story very well. How did he know? I have to find out who I am working for. Bai Yulon lowered his eyes and said softly, Don't worry, as long as you don't violate the Federation's laws, I don't care if you are the son-in-law of the Deputy Minister of National Defense. I only care about money. Since he knew that Park Ji-ho's fiancé was on the train and lived next door, Shu Le certainly wouldn't go to the bar to kill time. Although he did have a hobby of drinking now, if he really met a widow who was drowning her sorrows in alcohol, he really didn't know what would happen. After all, that widow's fiancé was killed by him. Shu Le didn't have any psychological burden when he killed Park Ji-ho. Even the Hushan Road incident was just a matter of seconds. However, he didn't want to meet the relatives of the deceased. When he was spat on by Park Ji-ho's younger sister in the district prosecutor's office, although it didn't dry up, he didn't feel angry. He just silently wiped it away. Park Ji-ho's fiancé probably didn't know him, let alone know that he killed Park Ji-ho. However, Shu Le didn't take the risk. It wasn't until late at night that he walked out of the compartment and walked to the lounge at the end of the train. He sat on the sofa in the corner and looked at the whistling night outside the window. The curved and decelerating glass windows made the scenery outside clear but not dazzling. The air noise caused by the high-speed train was also reduced to a minimum. He lit a cigarette and thought about the girl who was not far from him. He thought about Park Ji-ho's stunned and desperate expression under the knife at Hushan Road. He frowned slightly. In the dim light, a girl walked over and sat on the sofa not far from Shula. Smoking was allowed in the lounge. 3 single sofas were placed in a triangle. The designer probably meant that there were only 3 luxurious sofa compartments on the train. Shula, who was sitting in the corner, saw the girl coming and thought about what he had been thinking. The cigarette in his hand trembled, and the ashes fell on his knees. He looked a little embarrassed. He hurriedly tried to put out the cigarette. "No, my family often smokes. I'm used to the smell." Nan Xiangmei looked at the young man in the corner with a smile. She didn't secretly guess the identity of the other party. Although it was strange that the other party was staying in a luxurious compartment at such a young age, it was just that she misunderstood Shula's action of putting out the cigarette. She somewhat approved of this person's attentiveness and didn't want to be nosy. She was not used to riding in such a luxurious compartment. Although her family definitely didn't care about the cost, she only came here to accompany her friend. The sleeping compartment at night didn't shake much, but she was still more used to riding the old-fashioned train alone in her early years. That kind of shaking felt real. The lounge was very dim at night. After Shula heard the girl's words, he silently took back his hand that was putting out the cigarette. Looking at the calm smile on the girl's face, Shula knew that the other party should not be the widow that he didn't want to see. His mood was slightly relieved. People who met by chance on the journey might strike up a conversation or remain silent. At this time, the man and woman on the sofa were silent. The dim light didn't mean that it was ambiguous. The corner was darker. Shula quietly looked at the girl. The girl was wearing a plain dress, and her whole body exuded a sense of peace. At first, he didn't feel anything, but the more he looked at her, the more he could see the beauty of her face under her black hair. When he was in Donglin, he liked to look at the few beauties on the street. When he was a gatekeeper, he also saw many youthful bodies. With just a few glances, he found that this girl was outstanding. Chapter 208. The girl not far in front of him had a beautiful face. Her black hair gently covered her ears. There was a trace of calmness that could not be disturbed. It was pleasing to the eye, but it was only pleasing to the eye. Shula may not have reached the age where he could truly appreciate the beauty of the opposite sex, but he could feel that the other party was outstanding. However, this kind of excellence had nothing to do with him. His current state of mind had really been beyond the word lust for a long time. Previously, when he was nestled in the corner of the sofa, thinking about the widow on the other side of the wall, the reason why he silently smoked was because he remembered the state of mind when he learned of Zhong Xiaomeng's death. Vaguely, he could roughly understand the pain of Park Ji-ho's fiancée at this time. Under certain circumstances, the joys and sorrows of human beings should be interconnected. Young people's first love encountered the most unbearable encounter in the world. Shula was young, but as Li Xiaotong once said, there was a trace of loneliness in the old house. Love gradually drifted away from him. After several trips with Li Xiaotong and seeing the flattering attitude of the young stars, he did not even have the mood to play along. To get rid of this state of mind, he needed time, or another girl who could enter his heart. The light was dim, and the sound outside the window was light. The beautiful girl sat quietly beside him. Unfortunately, it was not that time, so Shula just kept silent. After an unknown period of time, the train suddenly slowed down. Shula woke up from his half-awake state and subconsciously looked out of the window. He saw a large area of lights in the distance of the plain. It should be a big city. He immediately thought that this should be the only stop on the way of the Beijing High-Speed Railway, the capital of South Kazhou. At this time, Nan Xiangmei, who was sitting in front of him on the sofa, was also awakened from her slight tiredness. She looked out of the window. Their eyes met on the glass that reflected the scene inside the carriage. At the same time, they were stunned. Nan Xiangmei rubbed the slightly curled thick black hair below her ear and smiled at Shula on the glass. Shula smiled and nodded, but still did not say anything. Shula felt for the cigarettes in his pocket and put the box on the coffee table. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep breath. He didn't know if it was because he clearly felt that the beautiful girl next to him was staring at him, but he actually didn't know what to do and coughed twice. Nan Xiangmei looked at him curiously. The two of them had been sitting in silence for at least an hour. They didn't say a word, but there was always some lingering curiosity. Especially at this time, the coughing sounds in the quiet car were so clear. Her pair of clear eyes overflowed with concern. Shula was a little embarrassed. He felt that it was not appropriate to stay here any longer. He reached for the cigarette box and prepared to leave. At this moment, the carriage stopped at the platform and the door opened. There should be passengers boarding the carriage. Shula was slightly surprised and turned his gaze to the corridor. There were only 3 luxurious soft sleeper compartments in this carriage. He and Bai Yulon occupied one. Park Ji-ho's fiancée and the beautiful girl in front of him, who he didn't know the name of, occupied the other one. The other one had been empty. But the problem was that it was only a few hours away from Harbor City. Could there be people coming on the way? While he was stunned, the uninvited guests had already passed through the corridor and directly came to the lounge. The 3 sofas occupied a large space. Shula wanted to go out at this time, but it was not convenient. Bai Yulon suddenly came to the corridor and stepped on the side of the carriage. She slightly lowered her head and was as quiet as usual. Seeing Bai Yulon suddenly appear, and then seeing the 2 people in front of him, Shula's heart slightly moved. He withdrew his hand from the cigarette box and carefully hid behind the sofa, hiding his face in the darkness. Generally speaking, it was used to describe a spring breeze, or a little girl who missed her brother, or a little girl who only met 3 months ago. It was rarely used to describe 2 big men. However, the 2 passengers who had boarded midway gave Shula, who was sitting on the sofa, a strong feeling. He even felt that if these 2 passengers were willing, they could carry the cold wind of winter in Linhai. Although there were only 2 people, the footsteps that seemed to trample on people's hearts were like thousands of soldiers and horses marching over. Among the 2 people, the one who walked in front was about 30 years old. His facial features were ordinary, but there was a sense of grace in his calm eyes. His shoulders were straight, but because of the grey coat, there was a sense of steepness. Under the guidance of the train attendant, this person did not enter his compartment, but went directly to the lounge. He walked so naturally that if he wanted to, everything in front of him should make way for him. When this man walked past Bai Yulon, he did not even look at her. Walking behind this man was a big man. He was 1.9 meters tall and was not far from the ceiling of the carriage. He had a shiny bald head, and a tattoo drilled out from his back, spreading along his neck to the back of his head. Under the dim light, it was impossible to see what the tattoo was, but it was probably a somewhat ferocious flower in full bloom. He was supposed to be an extremely oppressive man, but behind the 30-year-old man in front of him, he deliberately restrained his aura and tried to be as calm as possible. But when he followed the man through the corridor and passed by Bai Yulon, he inconspicuously turned his head to look at the delicate man. Bai Yulon still had her head lowered, as if she did not feel anything, but her right foot that was pressing against the wall of the carriage slid down a few inches. Shula had a natural instinct for danger. Although the 2 men in the car didn't show any malicious intent, he could feel that they were strong. He didn't know what kind of strength they were referring to, but seeing Bai Yulon, who was sleeping in the private room, quietly come to his side, it was enough to prove something. The ordinary-looking man sat on the only empty sofa in the lounge, and the bald tattooed man naturally stood behind him. The train slowly moved away from the capital of South Kuzhou. The waiter saw that the distinguished guests in the luxurious compartment did not seem to be sleepy, so he resisted the tiredness and politely served them a few cups of tea and 2 plates of snacks. The man was sitting on the sofa in a relaxed manner. He did not drink tea, but looked at the pack of cigarettes on the coffee table. Suddenly, he leaned over and picked it up, saying, "Good cigarettes, can I have one?" "You're welcome." The man's voice was not magical, but it was low and gentle, and somewhat pleasant to the ears. Shula said, and at the same time, handed over a lighter. Nan Xiangmei had been sitting quietly on the sofa. She really did not want to spend the night in that luxurious compartment like a luxury hotel. Previously, when she saw that the passenger who got on the train went directly to the lounge, she thought that he was someone Shula knew, but now she knew that she was wrong. She could not help but look at Shula in confusion. For some reason, Shula seemed to be able to understand the meaning of this beautiful girl, and he shook his head with a bitter smile. At this time, the sofa in the lounge was full. A bald tattooed man with a height of 1.9 meters was standing behind the man like a bodyguard. The delicate secretary was resting with her eyes closed in the corridor next to the lounge. The scene was somewhat strange. Nan Xiangmei also noticed this. She stood up, politely nodded to Shula, and was ready to go back to the room to rest. The unknown man sitting on the sofa suddenly smiled and said, "Miss Nan Xiangmei, I specially came to see you. Would you do me the honor of saying a few words?" Nan Xiangmei looked at the man seriously and curiously. She had to admit that although this man was obviously over 30 years old, he was not handsome, but his temperament was really attractive. What made her unable to leave immediately was that this man actually called her name. Did he really come here to see her? Xu Le, who was sitting in the corner, heard the words Miss Nan Xiangmei, and his heart couldn't help but tremble. Nan Xiangmei was a somewhat strange surname, but there were many people with this surname in the Federation. But the problem was that there were not many Miss Nan Xiangmei who could afford to live in a luxurious soft sleeper compartment. For Miss Nan Xiangmei to be specially visited by this man, there was only one possibility. One of the 7 major families in the Federation, the Nan Xiangmei family. In the dim light, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Shula's face. Unexpectedly, he could meet the miss of the Nan Xiangmei family on a casual trip. It seemed that he, an insignificant person, was really at odds with one of the 7 major families in the Federation. After a moment of daze, he was more interested in why the middle-aged man sitting on the sofa, who was obviously not an ordinary person, would choose to visit a beautiful girl who was so peaceful that no one could bear to disturb her in the middle of the night in a high-speed car. "Excuse me, who are you?" Nan Xiangmei looked curiously at the man on the sofa, as if he was not worried about her safety at all. "I was familiar with Nan Xiangshou in the past." When Nan Xiangmei heard this, she felt relieved. The Nan Xiong family had a very strict upbringing. Apart from true friends, very few people would know their real names. Since the other party could call out her brother's real name, he shouldn't be lying. "I have always heard that Miss Nan Xiangmei is a very outstanding woman." The man on the sofa looked at Nan Xiangmei gently. There was no superfluous emotion in his eyes, only endless admiration and pity. "Seeing you today, it is indeed so." Upon hearing this, Nan Xiangmei couldn't help but blush. She wasn't a person who was easily embarrassed, but for some reason, the praise from the man on the sofa was like the verdict of a certain professor in the Federation, giving the listener endless confidence. "Am I really an outstanding woman?" Thinking of this, she could not help but feel a little shy. Shula looked at the dark red color under Nan Xiangmei's white earlobes and could not help but be slightly startled. "Dohai is not good enough for you." The man on the sofa suddenly said seriously, "This marriage is called off." Hearing this sentence, Nan Xiangmei was shocked and immediately guessed the real identity of the man on the sofa. Among the 7 great families hidden in the shadows of the Federation, marriage was a very common thing. Once the parents of both sides decided, no one could stop it. Nan Xiangmei also could not escape this fate. However, at this moment, a strange man suddenly got on the train in the middle of the night, praised her with full of pity, and said that he wanted to call off the marriage. Among the 7 great families, probably only this person could ignore the authority of the elders and break the marriage between the 2 families with just a sentence. Nan Xiangmei slowly stood up with a trace of disbelief and looked at the man on the sofa in a daze. In the hearts of the children of the aristocratic families, this man in front of her was already a legend, and deeply respected. "Thank you." Shula was an outsider. He did not know Nan Xiangmei, and it was impossible for him to know who the man on the sofa was. So, he did not understand this conversation at all. He only felt that Miss Nan Xiangmei, who was silent in the middle of the night, seemed to be happy from the bottom of her heart. Chapter 209. He looked down and was about to speak, but the man on the sofa just smiled, then stood up and whispered to the extremely burly man behind him, "You can go now." The man lowered his head slightly, the dim light reflected on his bald head, making the lounge seem a little brighter. At this moment, Shula saw the face of the mysterious man clearly. He was indeed an ordinary person, wearing a light grey shirt. There was nothing special about him, but he gave people a feeling of a river. Although the words "you can go now" were said very softly, it fell into the ears of the people in the lounge. Shula was slightly surprised. He didn't understand where the other party was going. Judging from his tone, he didn't mean to rest in the compartment. But at this time, the train was moving at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour. Where could he go? Even the slightly bowed bald man didn't seem to expect that the man would say to go now, but he was slightly startled, nodded, and walked to the aisle next to the lounge, turned the wrench, and put his hand on the emergency brake device. The emergency brake device of the high-speed train was strictly prohibited from being pulled at will. There were obvious warning words on it, and there was a conspicuous red sign painted on it, but the tattooed bald man just turned it on naturally. He didn't care about the warning at all. Shula immediately understood what these two people were going to do. For a moment, he didn't know how many absurd feelings surged in his heart. He stared in disbelief at that place. That steady and strong hand pulled with all its might. Only to hear the rapid alarm sound. The harsh sound of the emergency brake penetrated the thick glass, piercing everyone's ears. The high-speed dense magnetic track carriage instantly slowed down. A huge braking force was transmitted from the carriage to everyone's body. Nan Xiangmei, who was standing with a confused face, didn't know what happened until now. She was hit by the braking force. For a moment, she lost her balance and fell forward. Shula's pupils shrank. He stared at the two arrogant men who didn't care about all the rules in the world, but he didn't stop them. He just tightly held both sides of the sofa to stabilize himself. At this time, he felt a fragrance in his arms. He subconsciously reached out to support Nan Xiangmei's body, his hand on the girl's waist, but he still couldn't stop Nan Xiangmei from falling into his arms, warm and tender. The ear-piercing braking sound finally stopped. The train was like a wounded serpent. After a long time, horrified shouts, loud curses and low cries came from the other carriages. There were only 3 rooms in the luxurious room, so it wasn't as noisy as the other rooms. However, the expressions on their faces were a little ugly. Nan Xiangmei finally woke up from her panic. She supported herself on Shula's shoulder and stood up. She hurriedly bowed her head and thanked him. Then, she lowered her head and walked towards the room. At the door of the room, she found that Meow Meow was waking up with sleepy eyes. No matter how deeply asleep a person was, they would still be affected by the sudden braking force. He woke up with a start. Shula subconsciously looked towards the corridor and saw that Magnolia was still standing quietly by the window. However, her feet were already on the floor, and her face was slightly pale. He didn't know what she was thinking. The man on the sofa was gone, and so was the bald man with a ferocious flower tattoo. There was no one in the lounge, as if the two people had never been there. Shula quickly turned back and looked out of the window. At this time, the lights in the carriage were turned on, illuminating the field around the magnetic track. This place should still be in the territory of South Kuzhou. The Federation's unified farm was densely planted in the fields. There were about 1 person planting a variety of grains. Under the night wind and the illumination of the train lights, the grains undulated like waves. Shula narrowed his eyes. He vaguely saw 2 figures in the waves of the grains, quietly moving towards the distance. The bald man silently followed the man in grey clothes through the difficult fields of the farm grains. He startled the voles and disturbed the insects. He was silent, without any doubts or questions. Gradually, they went farther and farther until they came to a small hill beside the field. The man in front stopped and looked back at the distant magnetic track with faint lights. He smiled. The man sat down and took out a flat metal bottle from his pocket. He took a small sip and then handed it behind him. The bald man also sat down beside him. He took the bottle and took a big gulp. After a moment of silence, he said, "I thought you would at least say a few words to that guy called Shula." The man smiled and said softly, "Sometimes, a glance is enough to see a person. There's no need to say anything." For a man who left home at a young age and was extremely rebellious, he had honed his strength to match this kind of rebellion. He had built such a large territory with his bare hands. Other than the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation, there were no rules in the Federation that were worthy of his attention. He had boarded the train in the middle of the night from South Cuzco just to see the man and woman. Since he had seen them, he was satisfied and naturally left. He came in high spirits and returned in high spirits. He did what he wanted. When he wanted to leave a certain place, he didn't want to stay for even a second. When he said he would leave without hesitation. As for the inconvenience and commotion that his jaw-dropping way of leaving would bring to the people on the train, it wasn't something he cared about. The thorny flower Baldy silently sipped his wine. He usually drank 3 catties of white wine, but the man beside him only had a small bottle on him. He drank it very carefully. Although he drank it in small sips, after a few sips, there wasn't a single drop left in the bottle. He turned his head to look at the man in front of him who was gnawing on a green plant. He knew that this man had always been used to doing as he pleased. But tonight, he still didn't understand why he wanted to see that young man called Shula. If the young lady of the Southern Prime Minister's family was involved in the man's younger brother's marriage, then what did Shula represent? That little guy called Shula, it seems that he still doesn't know what happened in S2 tonight. The man peeled off the outer layer of the green plant on his finger and sucked on the fragrant juice inside. He said in a muffled voice, "Once this matter is out, Lawyer Parbray will be in a terrible fix for a while. That old bastard Macklin will definitely cry in front of the Federation voters again. The hearts of the people can't be used up. Ross is also a smart person. He allowed Macklin to play as he pleased. The two of them took advantage of the situation and narrowed the gap between them a little." The thorny flower Baldy's expression calmed down. Although the activities of the upper echelons of the Federation and the circle of the Jianghu he belonged to were thousands of miles apart, he knew that the man beside him would never say anything meaningless. The Federation election is just a show. It's not a foreplay, but a climax that girls envy. Wave after wave, there will always be a break in between. Tonight's terrorist attack at the concert can be considered as a climax. The next climax will naturally be the development of the new Mecca of the Federation. There are still at least a few months in between. Logically speaking, the data from the laboratory should be in the hands of those hypocrites from the Federal Academy of Science. However, the nutshell engineering department has never let go of it. Moreover, Shula is currently heading to Hong Kong. This is somewhat interesting. The thorny flower Baldy had been silent the entire time. He believed that this matter had nothing to do with him or the man beside him who he respected so much. In my entire life, other than the first 2 years of recklessness, I have always been looking at those interesting people and things in the Federation. The man threw away the green plant in his hand and smiled as he looked up at the stars in the night sky. He said, "Nan Xiangmei is a very outstanding girl. How can a fool like Do Hai be worthy of her? Shula is also a very interesting person. I believe that he is also very clear about his own importance. The problem is that he doesn't show it. The one I don't understand the most is that old ghost, Macklin. He is the second leader of the anti-government army. He forcefully entered the political system of the Federation through non-violence. He completely broke away from the armed forces and even wants to be the vice president. The problem is that with his intelligence, how can he not understand that the anti-government army in the mountains is his most solid foundation? If the anti-government army is really turned into a pack of dogs by him, he can only be a forgotten character in the Federation. Even if he really becomes the vice president, in the future, he will only be a puppet. Moreover, the moves he used are too ruthless and too insidious. They are completely pushing the Federation down the path of chaos. What good does this do for him? If he is from the Empire, it would be easy to understand. The problem is that this old man is definitely not from the Empire. He is also an extremely strong fanatic. He smiled slightly and took back the bottle from the Baldy's hand. He found that it was already empty, so he couldn't help but shake his head. He took out a pack of cigarettes from his arms and gave one to the Baldy and lit one for himself. It was the pack of 37 brand cigarettes that he took out in the carriage. The Baldy squatted beside him and took a deep breath of the cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the man's side profile. Many people in the Federation were proud of his evaluation, but only he knew that the man beside him was truly famous for his unique vision. That pair of eyes that were praised by people for being able to appreciate beauty in the universe. Even the family that the man betrayed still needed his judgment from time to time. This was a rare opportunity, so the Baldy asked in a deep voice, "What do you think of the people involved in this matter?" Li Xiaozhu is only a bag of skin. When the man evaluated the young people of the 7 great families in the Federation, he actually had a sense of superiority. He said lightly, "On the contrary, the Li family's old 7 is much more outstanding than him. Those old men of the Li family are also blind. Make money, make money. It's good to have money. What good does it do to get involved in this matter? However, that brat Li Xiaotong isn't really smart. If he didn't want to get involved, then he shouldn't be so close to Shu Le." The topic turned back to Shu Le. Tonight, he boarded the car to look at people. This man was mainly looking at Shu Le. He was very curious about the young man who could fight Madman Li to a draw in his own shop. Other people in the Federation might not care about the fighting ability of these people, but this man was very clear about the terror of the Lis of Philadelphia. As for people like Minister Zhu's Thai family, he didn't want to pay attention to them. In fact, he didn't even care about the presidential election. He had already left that circle and had never thought about going back. He was disdainful to go out. In life, he wanted to be happy and do as he pleased. Therefore, he always only cared about the men or women he was interested in. "What do you think of that young man?" The bald man was silent for a long time before he said, "Looking at his behavior a while ago, he does have some of my subordinates' fierceness. But looking at him today, he seems a little lifeless. This kind of temperament is either hiding a ball of fire in his chest, waiting to explode, or he is really an ignorant stone, waiting to be washed away by the water until it becomes round and boring." The man smiled. He had always admired his subordinate's insight. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "Money can't buy youth. Now, I have always wanted to find the freedom I had when I broke the door, but after all, I am not that age anymore. This brat is so young and capable, but he is so restrained. It's really a pity. Being too young and not frivolous may be good for his future, but this kind of life is too boring. However, the delicate man next to him is quite interesting. Do you know who he is? It should be his secretary, Bai Yulon." Since they wanted to find out what train Shu Le was on, the bald man naturally did some work. He said with a smile, "Under the feminine appearance, there is a poisonous snake hiding. He can be considered a character. There are many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the Federation, not to mention in a gloomy place like Whitewater. I am just a little curious. How did a boring young man like Shu Le manage to subdue such a character?" The bald man smiled bitterly and looked at the vast wilderness under the hill, where there was no road in front of them and no airport behind them. He said, "I am just curious. Are we going to walk back to Nanki?" Shu Le lowered his head and drank the water in the cup. He felt that there was no taste in his mouth. Previously, the emergency brake had caused the cup in the luxury box to fall to the ground, and many places were wet. At this time, Bai Yulon was silently cleaning up. The patrol on the high-speed train had already been here before. This kind of vicious incident caused a commotion, so naturally, they needed a reason to quell it. The fingerprints on the emergency brake had been sampled. Shu Le and Nan Xiangmei were both interviewed for a few minutes before the train started again. They didn't have to wait for a long time to solve the case. Shu Le looked at the dark wilderness outside the window and couldn't help but think of the back of the 2 people in the waves that were taller than a person's head. Using this kind of method to leave was not only elegant, but also arrogant. Shu Le should be against this kind of behavior from the bottom of his heart, but he didn't know why. But when he thought of the style of the 2 people, there was a trace of yearning and desire. At this time, Bai Yulon had finished cleaning up the carriage and sat back in front of him. She was quiet and didn't say a word. Shu Le looked at her and couldn't help but ask, "I don't know the identity of the 2 people just now." The 20 million had already been accepted. Bai Yulon played the role of a personal secretary perfectly. She replied softly, "He's a powerful character." This was nonsense. Although Shu Le didn't have the urge to take back the 20 million, he was still a little unhappy and lowered his head. "I only know the bald guy with the flower tattoo." Bai Yulon lowered his eyes and took out a small knife from his trouser pocket with his right hand and calmly placed it beside him. When the two men got on the train, he had been keeping his hand in his trouser pocket. His fingers might have been holding this delicate knife all the time. Bai Yulon was a delicate man, and the weapon he used was also very delicate. It was naturally inconvenient to use a military knife outside, so he changed to a small knife, but still looked delicate. But just like him, the delicate appearance was just a means to hide the terrifying coldness. At the mention of the man with the ferocious flower tattoo, the delicate man's face turned slightly pale. He wasn't nervous, but rather excited. However, his voice was still extremely soft and gentle. I'm the one who takes on all of Team 7's private jobs. The company also often takes on some shady missions, so I do know a little about these reckless people in the Federation. Shula raised his head and looked at him with some surprise. He was just asking casually, but he didn't expect Bai Yulon to really recognize the man. The big man with the flower tattoo is called Zhong Xiaohua. Bai Yulon pinched the delicate knife between her two fingers and carefully trimmed her nails. She lowered her head and said, "Don't be fooled by his old-fashioned and stingy name. He's actually a very magnanimous person. All the underground businesses in South Kazhou are under his control. Most people call him Uncle Hua. Don't be fooled by his appearance. The big guy is actually very wise. In fact, this Uncle Hua of South Kazhou is as meticulous as his name suggests. You must know that there is no future in the underworld of the Federation. Regardless of whether guns are banned or not, as long as the Constitution exists, as long as the government doesn't like it, they can casually kill these reckless people. But this Uncle Hua is still alive, and he is living a good life. Just this point alone is enough to make people admire him." Shula heard this and nodded. He remembered when he was young, the underworld of Hushi State was defeated and disbanded because of the government. They retreated to the orphans behind Zhonglo Street, which indirectly led to his first killing. The Federation doesn't allow vicious cases to happen, and law and order have been good for countless years. The underworld does not seem to have a future. When this Uncle Hua started his career at the beginning of the year, he had a murder case. I don't know where his luck came from, but he actually found a boat and hid in Bermuda for a few years. Then, for some reason, he returned to the Federation and turned himself in. For some reason, the district court was lenient. In total, he only spent 7 years in prison. How old is Uncle Hua now? Should be 43. Normally, Shula would ask Bai Yulon at this time. If he were to face Uncle Hua head-on, he would probably have a chance of winning. However, Shula had never been very curious in this aspect, and he didn't think that he would meet Uncle Hua in the future, so he didn't ask. Bai Yulon had finished trimming her nails and sheathed her knife. She lowered her head and calmly said, "I'm probably not his match, but if he wants to kill me, he will have to shed at least 3 pounds of blood." Shula was slightly startled, but then he thought that if the bald man named Zhong Xiaohua was such a sharp character, then what kind of character would that 30-year-old man be? Chapter 210. Why did the whistle of the 37th Constitutional Era make a whistling sound? The Harbour City Tourism Bureau wanted to add a retro style to the high-speed rail. It was said that this was a political achievement that Governor Ross was very proud of. Didn't anyone say that the passageways and huts that were deliberately painted in the color of logs were ugly? Harbour City was the largest and most prosperous city in the Federation. The early morning wind blew through the wide streets, the towering buildings, the dense viaducts and light rail, and the sleepy young men and women. Where did they come from? From the absurdity of the night. If it was night time, what kind of lights would this huge city shine under the clouds? Would it be like a monster? At this time, the cement and glass intertwined, which already gave people pressure. If it was dark at night, would it make people want to vomit? Desire. People lived according to the arrangement of desire, especially in this city called Harbour City. He thought of those young men and women with heavy makeup. Their day was a dream, and their night was absurd. Why could the air of this city faintly smell the disgusting smell of bodily fluids? He thought of vomiting again. Shula pulled the heavy black box and stood silently at the entrance of the Harbor City high-speed rail station. The exit was on the lower floor of the station's giant dome building. Facing the big lake of Harbor City was the famous Federation. The lake water in the early morning didn't have a trace of freshness. It was only warm to the point that it made people feel a little wet. Sang Lake, the largest lake in the city among the 3 major regions of the Federation and several galaxies. Across the slightly foggy lake, a large number of densely packed high-rise buildings symbolizing wealth and status could be seen. The distance between those buildings was so close that they actually blocked the rising sun from the east, making this bustling city inexplicably reveal a trace of gloomy feeling. What a shitty place. It was the first time that Shula came to the most famous harbor city in the Federation, but he didn't have the slightest excitement. He lowered his head and softly cursed. He pulled the box and walked outside. Bai Yulon, who was not far behind him, silently looked at his back and followed him. Bai Yulon knew that Shula was not in a good mood. In fact, that quiet and honest face of his seemed to be hiding an uncontrollable anger. But where did this anger come from? In Bai Yulon's heart, Shula had always been a calm and collected young man who was used to facing everything with a cheerful smile. There had been no problems during the journey last night as well, so why did his mood suddenly change so much? It was definitely not because of the 2 men who got on the bus halfway, nor was it because of the young lady of the South Prime Minister's family. It also had nothing to do with Park Ji-ho's widow. So where did this sudden change in mood come from? Bai Yulon furrowed her eyebrows as she watched Shula's back. She thought of the images in the morning news and vaguely understood. However, she didn't understand why that piece of news in District S2 would change Shula from a quiet and self-contained young man into a young man who would become incomparably enraged by anything he saw, gradually becoming bitter and unkind. The taxi came, and Shula and Bai Yulon got on. The taxi drove for more than 40 minutes, but they still only passed through a very small area of Harbor City. The car passed through these streets and alleys, and overpasses. Shula narrowed his eyes as he looked at the unfamiliar city streets outside the window. His expression gradually calmed down, but the trace of irritation hidden in his eyes would never stop. From time to time, the sound of emergency news on the big screen on the street would spread into the taxi. The current death toll is more than 300 people. Last night, at the invitation of the government of the 4 states and Senator Medellin, Jen Shueya held a concert called Peace in Region S2. This concert was not to promote the presidential election of Governor Ross and Senator Medellin, but to repair the emotional scars between the ordinary citizens of the Federation and the people of the 4 states as much as possible. However, a sudden suicide terrorist attack made this scar seem deeper and more bloody. The tragic scenes in the news picture, the moaning of the injured in the ambulances and the hospital, the cold and gradually rising number of casualties, were like cold question marks, asking everyone in the Federation. Shula sat up straight on the sofa with his hands on his knees. He silently and attentively watched the scenes in the news. He had not heard the name Jen Shueya for several days. Recently, the TV series on Channel 23 of the Federation had changed to 1 episode a week. It was said that this national idol of the Federation was too busy with her studies. He did not expect to hear news of Jen Shueya again. It was so sudden that it was hard for him to accept. Shula was an angry youth. He had always thought that Jen Shueya had saved him in the Linhai State Gymnasium. He owed her a life. The news confirmed that Jen Shueya was still alive, so he was not too worried. The reason for his anger was the innocent casualties in the news picture. The people who had happily welcomed the new future of the Federation had disappeared into the black smoke. The images on the news switched back to the studio from the scene of the S2 mountain ring around the 4 states. In the studio, the middle-aged host was saying something to 2 anti-terrorism experts. Shula did not listen to the specific process of the terrorist attack. Under the pressuring of the host, the 2 experts were still unwilling to guess who the mastermind behind the terrorist attack was. The Federation had the terrifying enemy of the Empire, but under the glory of the Constitution, within the Federation, the only force that had the ability to avoid the joint surveillance of the Federation military and police, create such a shocking tragedy, and have reason to do this, should be the anti-government army. On the last day of last year, Senator Parbray had brought the Federation a New Year's gift that the people had been longing for. The anti-government army and the Federation government had officially reached a reconciliation agreement. Under this background, although the two anti-terrorism experts had probably long determined who the mastermind behind the scenes was, they were still cautious and refused to open their mouths. Senator Medellin is about to make an announcement. The middle-aged streamer looked at the camera with a solemn expression and said, "At such a critical moment, we would also like to know what Senator Macklin, as the second leader of the anti-government army who has always insisted on anti-violence, will say to the entire Federation." The news footage switched from the studio back to the scene of District S2. Surrounded by countless reporters and cameras, Senator Macklin, who was wearing a black suit, slowly walked onto the news platform. This legendary politician was affected by the terrorist attack last night and also suffered some minor injuries. However, on his old and wise face, there was only determination and calmness. In the face of the reporters and the cameras, the old and calm Senator Macklin did not immediately begin to read his announcement. Instead, he slowly looked around. The noise around him gradually subsided. Senator Medellin said with a firm and powerful voice, "This is the most critical moment for the Federation, and also the most dangerous moment. Some people are not willing to give up their position and power, so they use violence to warn us. Some people are not willing to see peace, so they use death to warn us. Some people." Senator Medellin's old voice paused for a moment, and with a hint of sadness, he said, "Were my friends, but after last night, they will be my enemies." Senator Medellin looked at the crowd in front of the Parliament building quietly and slowly raised his right hand. "Some people want to use violence and death to warn us, infuriate us, and destroy the current peace situation of the Federation, but we," his voice became heavier, and he said word by word, "if we also use violence and death to respond to them, then what is the difference between us and them? I have 7 friends that I spend time with every day, and they died in this shameless assassination. I also know that 300 people, or even more, died with them." Senator Medellin's eyes were a little wet, and his old voice sounded very moving in the cold wind of the Parliament building. "In order to kill me, this old man, so many innocent people have died. I feel endless sadness and guilt." Then, his old body bent down and bowed at a 90-degree angle. After a long time, the flashes around him sounded. Shula quietly watched Senator Medellin's speech on the news. Then, he lowered his head, crossed his legs, and buried his head between his knees. He said in a low voice, "Fuck you." Chapter 211. After Bai Yulon gave the waiter a tip, she quietly stood behind the sofa with her hands tucked into her pants. She leaned against the wall with a floral pattern and calmly and indifferently looked at Shula's back. He had already confirmed that Shula's anger hidden behind his silence was directed at the terrorist attack last night. But what did the incident in District S2 have to do with this young technical director? Why was he so sensitive and angry? What do you think of this? Shula, who was sitting on the sofa, suddenly asked without turning around. Bai Yulon's eyelids drooped slightly as she looked at the tip of her shiny leather shoes. After a moment of silence, she said, "The anti-government forces have already issued an announcement condemning this terrorist attack. Councilman Prabel's office also reacted as soon as possible. Unless the Bureau of Proclamation can trace the dead back to the anti-government army, they will definitely not admit to it. I don't think this was the decision of the Anti-Government Army Committee. It should be the work of some young hardliners." Bai Yulon lowered his head and analyzed. Because he was a secretary who received 20 million, he didn't understand what this major incident in the Federation had to do with himself and Shula, but he still spoke softly. "It seems that the rumor that there are hardliners in the anti-government army in the mountains who are very dissatisfied with Senator Medellin's capitulation and want to use blood to punish him is true. Next, someone will have to pay the price. Regardless of whether the investigation results are found or not, the president has to give the victims of the attack an explanation." Bai Yulon raised her head, shrugged, and said, "If the war starts again, Senator Parbel will suffer the most. The reconciliation agreement reached before the year will become a piece of paper. His biggest political capital in the presidential election will immediately depreciate, and it might even become a debt. This wasn't a very good analysis. Magnolia's delicate appearance hid a fierce fighting ability, but he was not a strategic analyst after all. The experts on the TV news who were bolder because of Senator Macklin's speech also began to analyze the impact of the attack on the concert on the peace process of the entire Federation, as well as the impact of the presidential election that was going to be held in full swing this fall. Schuler lifted his head from between his knees and looked at the news expressionlessly. He knew that there was nothing wrong with Magnolia's analysis. Just like what most people had guessed and thought, no one would think that the mastermind behind this terrorist attack was Senator Macklin. This was because even if Senator Parbray's election was thwarted, Senator Macklin, as the second-in-command of the anti-government forces, would still be viewed with hostility by many of the Federation's voters. Senator Macklin's image in front of the people of the Federation was that of an old man who abided by nonviolence. He had no reason or ability to create such a terrorist attack. None of the citizens of the Federation would doubt the old man, especially after the tearful scene just now. The people who had calmed down even faintly hoped that the peace process of the Federation would not end because of this terrorist attack. Then, who else could lead the negotiations between the government and the 4 provinces in the future other than Senator Medellin, who had 7 of his subordinates tragically killed and himself injured? Although there were tens of millions of people, Schuler watched the news in silence, not believing it. He didn't have any evidence, and he didn't even have the logic to make an inference. He just relied on his intuition and his twisted personality to attribute the responsibility of the attack on the concert in the 4 provinces to Macklin. This was an unreasonable way of thinking. The delicate secretary behind him wouldn't think this way, and the officials wouldn't think this way either. However, Schuler was someone who had experienced the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium. His poor woman, his fugitive brother, told him with bloody facts that Macklin was the most insidious, cunning, and vicious mastermind in the Federation, a mastermind who had deceived everyone in the world. Just like the conversation with Inspector Xiao outside the district procurator's office, Schuler only believed in his own principles now. He believed that Macklin was evil, and this old man who was deeply respected by the people was evil. On the news, Senator Macklin's speech had ended, and the reporters were applauding sincerely. Schuler felt unusually depressed and gloomy. He turned off the TV, walked into the bathroom, and took a cold shower. Under the cold water, he lowered his head and cursed softly. The water was as cold as snowflakes floating down in June. The terrorist attack on the concert last night was indeed shocking, but the citizens of the Federation who saw those images couldn't help but feel sad and angry. However, it was an incident that happened in the 4 provinces of S2. The people living in S1 might feel sad because of it, but this emotion shouldn't last long. After a while, they might even forget. The most prosperous city in the Federation, Harbor City, was a giant cold forest addicted to wealth and technology. It was good at forgetting and good at continuing its life after sighing. Pier 17 was not a pier, but Harbor City's most high-end leisure area. All kinds of bars and restaurants were quietly hidden within the complex streets and alleys. The news that was repeatedly playing on the news was no longer able to attract the attention of the diners. Only Schuler was still looking at the holographic screen above his head with narrowed eyes. He was eating with Bai Yulon. Opposite them were 2 men. One was Ju Yu, and the other was a slightly plump, somewhat dignified middle-aged man. The middle-aged man looked coldly at Schuler, and after a moment, said rudely, "Young man, is there something wrong with your brain? Why did you suddenly come to Harbor City?" Ju Yu smiled bitterly and glanced at Schuler. Currently, the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department were competing to develop the new generation of the Federation's MX mecha. Ju Yu had always played the role of a middleman, responsible for transferring Schuler's core data back to the engineering department. He also did not understand why Schuler would suddenly come to Harbor City and request to meet with a powerful person in the engineering department. Hearing this rudeness, Schuler retracted his gaze and looked at the official from the Nutshell Engineering Department. He lowered his head and said, It's clearly stated in the agreement that I can follow the progress of the mecha research at any time. The middle-aged man was a senior manager of the Nutshell engineering department. Not within the company, even within the Federation, he could be considered an extremely respected figure. He looked at Shu Le and could not help but laugh mockingly. What a naive child. Then, the man said coldly, but it's good that you're here. According to the information we received, the Academy of Science has a bit more core data model than us. How do you explain that? Also, when are you going to give me the function formula? Since you're here today, you should settle this matter first. This kind of condescending tone was only natural in the eyes of this person. The young man sitting opposite him was only a level 3 technical supervisor. If he had not been so lucky as to follow Professor Shin, how could such a small fry be involved in the Federation's revolutionary new mecha research? As for the cooperation agreement, this senior manager did not believe it at all. In his opinion, a small fry like Shu Le did not have the qualifications to talk to the Tai family, or to be more precise, talk to him about any kind of deal. Shu Le quietly looked at this slightly plump senior manager. Suddenly, he turned his head and said to Juyu, "He doesn't know who I am?" Juyu lowered his head and gave a bitter laugh. The senior manager who had come to meet Shu Le today had the surname Hao. He held an extremely important position in the engineering department. Manager Hao, who knew the inside story, obviously knew that this young man had played an important role in this matter. However, he felt that in front of him, in the Tai family, in the Shell Motor Corporation engineering department, this young man should have the self-awareness to hand over everything and not try to bargain. To be more precise, Manager Hao felt that Shu Le should be hugging his leg and begging him to use the data. Shu Le lowered his head and said, "I want a mecha." The senior manager seemed to have heard something unbelievable. The corners of his lips curled up slightly, revealing a mocking smile. He maintained his silence and could not be bothered with Shu Le. He gently stirred his coffee cup. Shu Le waited for a while, then dialed a number. He said to the person on the other end of the line, "I'm currently talking to a manager with the surname Hao. It's not a very pleasant conversation. Your request is a bit too high. I might not be able to satisfy you. I'm not in a good mood today," Shu Le said softly into the phone. "If we can't reach an agreement, then forget it." He hung up the phone, stood up, and prepared to leave. Juyu had gradually gotten a better understanding of Shu Le's personality after interacting with him for the past few days. He knew that this young squatter had a different temperament from everyone in the Federation. What Nutshell Mobility Company? What Tai family? What Tai family? What Nutshell Mobility Company? What Tai family? Perhaps they could make him feel some fear, but if he was truly pushed to the edge, he would really do anything. Manager Hao stared in disbelief at Shu Le, who was preparing to leave. He had not expected this young man's reaction to be so big. He stared coldly at Shu Le, lowered his head, and said calmly, "Don't forget Professor Shen's name. In the entire Federation, under the pressure of Dean Lin, the only ones who can continue to help you are us." Shu Le had originally planned to pretend that he did not hear this person speak, but when he heard his teacher's name, he stopped his thoughts of turning and leaving. He stared at Manager Hao's plump face like he was staring at a flower that was about to bloom. Manager Hao smiled and said, "Calm down a little, young man. There's no good in being too easily angered." Right at this moment, the phone in Shu Le's hand rang. After the call was connected, the voice on the other end was silent for a moment before saying, "I will get someone to prepare a mecha, but at most, it will be an M50 or less." Shu Le stared at Manager Hao's face and said into the phone, "Sure, but I don't want to talk to this piece of trash surnamed Hao. If Juyu's position on your side is not high enough, you can get someone else to come." When Manager Hao heard the word piece of trash, he abruptly raised his head, slammed the table angrily, and stood up. He extended a finger to point at Shu Le's nose and scolded, "You little." He only had time to say the word little. Shu Le was an easily angered young man, but he had always been very angry today. Bai Yulon, who had been standing silently beside him all this time, had been carefully observing his reactions. She knew that if this fellow vented his anger, it would be a very scary thing. So when Manager Hao stood up, she silently took a step forward and stood in front of Shu Le, one hand gripping Manager Hao's finger. With a crisp crack, the finger broke. Chapter 212. Why was it so brittle? Buried in the snow, frozen in the ice, dried in the wind, like a carrot with a beautiful heart. With a snap, it broke without a trace. Even the sound was crisp. Bai Yulon lowered her head and twisted her finger. Manager Hao's angry finger was deformed with a snap, just like the plate of crispy cucumber on the dining table. His chubby face immediately paled. The sharp pain from his bent fingers reached Supervisor Hao's brain. He did not have time to consider why the two young people sitting in front of him would be so reckless, so daring, and so vicious. He only had time to open his mouth like a child and reveal his smoke-stained teeth. He was prepared to turn the pain into a scream of pain. Bai Yulon kept her head down and stood gently beside Shu Le. Her left hand had already picked up a piece of bread from the table and brought it to Manager Hao's mouth at some point. She coldly stuffed it in, turning the scream he hadn't yet let out into a muffled grunt. Manager Hao's mouth was stuffed with bread. Beads of sweat flowed down his face. His pupils constricted and his body collapsed. He held his hand in pain and leaned on the sofa, his body curling up in pain. Ju Yu abruptly stood up and stared at the delicate man in disbelief. He didn't know the identity of the delicate man beside Shu Le, but he really didn't expect that the other party would be so ruthless just because of a small disagreement. Bai Yulon didn't even look at Ju Yu. She kept her head down and took a step back. She retreated behind Shu Le, as if nothing had happened. She was ladylike and calm. Shu Le's contact with the Nutshell Engineering Department was, of course, very careful in order to hide it from the eyes of many people in the Federation. The two parties arranged to meet in the depths of an inconspicuous restaurant at Pier 17. The previous scene didn't alarm the other diners. He held the phone in his right hand and looked at the chubby manager on the sofa. He then raised his head to look at Ju Yu and shook his head. Ju Yu's brows furrowed as he looked at Bai Magnolia. He wondered where Shu Le had found such a person. She looked like a girl, but when she fought, she was so direct and ruthless. I'll send Supervisor Hao to the hospital. Ju Yu looked at Shu Le and sighed. I don't know what's wrong with you today. Why is your temper so bad? Shu Le did not expect Secretary Bai to publish the book before him. Furthermore, she broke the other party's finger. If it was in the past, he would definitely not agree with this. However, for some reason, he was only startled today and did not express any opinion. He nodded at Ju Yu and walked out of the restaurant with the white magnolia. He spoke into the phone, Manager Hao needs to go to the hospital and can't talk to me. You should choose someone else to talk to me. My request is still the same. Ju Yu helped Supervisor Hao stand up. He smiled bitterly and wanted to say a few words of comfort, but he didn't know what to say. By this time, Supervisor Hao had adapted to the pain of his broken finger. His face was pale as he spat out the bread in his mouth with his tongue. He was battered and exhausted, but he bitterly cursed, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. Ju Yu was silent for a few seconds before reminding him, Shu Le has been speaking directly with Secretary Shen. The previous call should have been made to Great Secretary Shen. This sentence did not reveal much information, but it was very important. When Supervisor Hao heard the words Great Secretary Shen, he suddenly froze in place. He was silent for a long time, as though he had forgotten about his broken finger. He looked at the restaurant's exit with resentment. He knew that he had misunderstood the true meaning of today's meeting. He had completely misjudged the background of the third-level technical supervisor. It was transformed into an external display of stubbornness and stubbornness. Now, this temperament was gradually revealed due to his anger. Unfortunately, before he could show anything, the usually silent Bai Yulon made a move first. Shu Le looked back at Bai Yulon, smiled, and said, let's go for a drink. Not far in front of the two of them, there was a tavern emitting the smell of oak. Zhong Xiaohua, the big boss of Nanqi, could easily find out that Shu Le had left the capital special district and was heading to the port city. He could find out which train he had taken and which carriage he had taken. He did not know if the Federal Academy of Science and the Lee family had relaxed their surveillance of him, but Shula was a very careful person. Looking at the 30-year-old amber wine gently swirling in his glass, Shula thought of the ancient song called 27 Days of Wine. Naturally, he thought of Childshire, who loved to sing this song with tears streaming down his face. He raised his glass to the same level as his eyebrows and stared blankly at the wine in his glass. Through the wine, he noticed the two drinkers in the dark corner of the tavern entrance. The two drinkers looked very normal, but Shula felt that there was something wrong. If they were spies like Shi Qinghai, who had received a systematic and cruel education, they would definitely be able to find loopholes in the many details surrounding these two drinkers. However, Shula did not have this ability. He only had a natural sense for danger, and after escaping from the Donglin district, he was always cautious at every moment. He did not know if they were government agents or peripheral military personnel from the engineering department. If they were professionals sent by the Lee family, then this matter was somewhat troublesome. Shula stared blankly at the wine in his glass. This trip to the port city was originally just to see if Secretary Shen was sincere in fulfilling the agreement. At the same time, he also thought about the development of the new generation of MX Mecha. He wanted to see the progress of the engineering department and see if he needed to take the risk to provide those solutions. He brought Secretary Bai here because Secretary Bai had personally operated this new type of mecha before. If he could have a private space to face the new type of mecha, then Secretary Bai would be equivalent to his test pilot. The Lee family and the Academy of Science would probably not believe that he had the core data. Since Secretary Shen trusted the engineering department, then the Tai family must have a great influence on the upper management of the Nutshell engineering department. There would not be a problem of secrets being leaked. However, if the eldest young master of the Lee family knew that he had come to the port city, would he think more? At the very least, he could not let the other party see that he was in contact with the Nutshell engineering department. Shula put down his wine glass. Just as he was about to stand up, he realized that Bai Magnolia, who had been silently drinking orange juice on his left, had once again stood up before him. Bai Magnolia put the ice in her mouth. Without saying anything, she walked towards the back of the pub. The two people in the shadows at the entrance had already planned for this situation. One of them pretended to be drunk and followed her to the back of the pub. No matter how prosperous the city, no matter how modern the era was, the back of the pub was always quiet, messy, and dirty. There were rats in the trash bins, pee stains under the paint peeling off the walls, and traces of vomiting last night. Bai Magnolia did not smoke and did not drink today. Naturally, she would not vomit in the back alley. She just closed her eyes, unzipped her pants, and happily peed. The pub patron also came to the back alley and started to pee. He did not need to follow them, but he was worried that the two targets would split up. Therefore, to be careful, he did not want to let the target out of his sight. There are so many people drinking at noon in the port city. Bai Magnolia trembled and silently walked towards the pub patron. She said softly, "You did not pee. It's none of your fucking business." The pub patron realized that there was something wrong, but he still acted very calmly and fiercely. With a puff, the pub patron realized that the handsome man beside him had opened his mouth and spat something sharp towards his face. As a professional, he certainly knew that it was not saliva. Naturally, he associated it with some insidious hidden weapons in the rumors and quickly retreated. His retreat was not as fast as Bai Magnolia's advance. The pub patron groaned and touched his waist with his right hand, while the two fingers of his left hand fiercely pierced into Bai Magnolia's expressionless eyes. However, he lost his balance at this time because Bai Magnolia had lowered his head and stepped forward, coincidentally stepping on his shoelaces. With the two fingers in the air, Bai Magnolia's left hand turned into a knife and smoothly chopped towards the pub patron's neck. There was no wind, but it was extremely cold. The pub patron did not have time to take out his gun. He blocked it with his arm and quickly stepped back with his left foot, stepping on the wet ground of the back alley to keep his balance. However, he immediately felt that the other side of his neck was cold. Bai Magnolia loosened his right hand. He did not know when there was a delicate knife in his right hand. At this time, the delicate knife had been quietly inserted into the pub patron's neck, like a branch inserted into the soil. He then loosened the shoelaces of his right foot and reached out to grab the pub patron's tie, not letting the still twitching body fall down. By Magnolia opened the garbage bin, stuffed the pub patron into it and carefully pulled out the knife. Almost at the same time, he quickly closed the lid of the garbage bin. Through the metal lid, the sound of rain spraying faintly sounded in the garbage bin. By Magnolia wiped the knife clean and walked into the pub with a calm face. Chapter 213. The glass of amber liquor was still on the black and white stone table. The wine was fermented and distilled, mixed with years of time in the cellar. It gradually permeated into people's noses. Although it was not as clear as the diluted essence sprayed from the oak barrel outside the pub, it was very infectious, as if it had a life of its own. Harbor City was a city that was greedy for enjoyment. These days were the Federation's summer holidays. Therefore, although it was still noon, there were already several tables of guests in the dark pub. Xu Le, who was sitting at the bar, was not conspicuous. He stared at the liquor in the glass in a daze, thinking about the changes in his mood from last night to today. He was silent for a while. Bai Yulon came back alone and sat beside him. She silently began to sip the orange juice that was about to reach the bottom. The ice cubes under the fancy straw rolled in the orange juice, looking very cute. The drinker did not come back. Xu Le guessed what had happened. He did not expect that Secretary Bai would take the initiative to work for him. He thought of the tea in the luxurious room and the work of making the bed. He was a little confused for a moment. 20 million was indeed a lot of money, but it was not a loss to buy such a handsome man who was almost omnipotent to work for him. For a moment, he forgot that Li Xiaotong had invested 30 million yuan in him, which was already a very bold and very risky investment. However, he had casually given 20 million yuan to buy Magnolia, which made the hidden meaning behind it even more obvious. Xu Le glanced at Bai Magnolia. Bai Magnolia lowered her voice and said slowly, "I don't do anything illegal." That person fainted. Xu Le smiled bitterly. It wasn't because of Bai Yulon's decision, but because someone was keeping an eye on him. It meant that the person who planned everything out didn't forget about him just because of Secretary Shen's phone call and the data transfer. This was a very troublesome thing. Even if he could quietly enter the Nutshell Engineering Department later, this matter could not be hidden from many people in the Federation. The straw made a cute gurgling sound. Bai Magnolia smiled and asked the bartender for another glass. Xu Le looked at the silent phone beside the glass. The conditions he had proposed to the Tai family were indeed a little too much in the eyes of the average person, and could even be called wishful thinking. However, since he had already decided to help the engineering department develop the MX mecha as quickly as possible, he had to get some benefits he urgently needed. He was waiting for Secretary Shen's final decision. A Federation military mecha was something he needed, and before tonight, he had to enter the heavily guarded engineering department. The waiting process was a little boring. Xu Le tilted his head and looked at Bai Magnolia's delicate features with great interest. He suddenly said, "I remember you said that you like to enjoy life, and that you have a few bottles of Wen Jun No. 3 at home." Wen Jun brandy was one of the most famous spirits in the Federation. It was produced in Region S3's Ganju Hill district, named after the scientist in the five-man team who liked to drink. The brand was authorized and protected by the HTD Bureau of the Federation. Among them, the No. 3 bottles were all treasures that had been in the cellar for more than 30 years. They had a soft taste, a rich aroma, and were surprisingly expensive. "Brandy, I like to drink apple-flavored." Bai Magnolia narrowed her eyes and looked at the glass of orange juice in her hand. She said, "The real best is still the compound wheat wine from the Han estate. It's cleaner." Xu Le thought that if Shi Qinghai was here, he would have a lot in common with this delicate man. Speaking of which, Shi Qinghai had a pair of peach blossom eyes and handsome features, but he was very masculine. Secretary Bai's features, on the other hand, didn't have any seductive features. They were just quiet and gentle, and truly feminine. "Why don't you have a drink?" Xu Le raised the glass in his hand and suggested, "It tastes good. It's real wine. I never drink during work hours, replied By Magnolia softly. Bai Yulon replied softly. She lowered her eyes slightly and glanced over from the corner of her eyes. She noticed that the drinker at the entrance of the pub seemed to have noticed something strange. The speed at which he turned the square cup in his hand was faster than before. Small details revealed a person's true emotions. The speed at which one spun the glass often represented the degree of anxiety in one's heart. How much longer do we have to wait? Asked By Magnolia softly. Shula looked at the silent phone on the table. After a moment of silence, he shook his head. If Secretary Shen didn't call again, things would take a different direction. By Magnolia glanced at the side of his face. Looking at this young technical director's ordinary face, she didn't say anything else. In the private meeting in the restaurant earlier, the information revealed in those few words had already allowed By Magnolia to understand many things. Even though Shula still hadn't told her clearly, she knew, this 20 million Federation dollars was really not easy to earn. This matter seemed to involve the development of the new generation of the Federation mecha, the MX mecha. As the former combat director of Whitewater Company's Team 7, By Magnolia had personally participated in the secret experiment conducted in the Bermuda Triangle Star region last autumn. Of course, she knew what this meant. By Magnolia glanced at Shula's side profile again. She thought to herself that this time, she had really played it big. All the private jobs she had taken on in her life added up together weren't this big. However, this delicate man had always been an extremely professional person. Since he had accepted the huge sum of 20 million Federation dollars, he would definitely complete this private job. Thus, he had killed people in the alleyway to establish his authority, using this sort of cruel bloodshed to temporarily intimidate those who were tailing Shula. By Magnolia only did things, she wouldn't explain anything to Shula. As the Federation's most elite professional soldier, he had left the military for many years, often carrying out shady missions for the government. He didn't have much of a concept of good and evil. As for the Federation's #1 organization, the glory of the Charter, he also had enough knowledge and small tricks to deceive the public. The precision and density of the Federation's electronic surveillance network was something that few people knew better than him, a mercenary soldier of the Federation. This delicate man wouldn't do anything illegal for money, but if there was enough money, killing people for Shula would be as natural as serving Shula tea and food. The phone finally rang again. The sound wasn't loud, but it pulled Shula and By Magnolia out of their respective thoughts. Shula picked up the phone and listened for a few words. His expression gradually calmed down, and there was a smile in his slightly squinted eyes. However, that smile was a habit, and not a joy that came from the heart. Let's go. Shula took out a $100 bill and put it on the table. He smiled at the bartender and greeted him. Then, he stood up. Seeing that the target had the intention to leave, the stalker who was pretending to be drunk at the entrance of the bar didn't know what to do. His companions had followed the man who looked like a woman to the back alley, but the target had returned, but his companions hadn't. A strong sense of foreboding emerged in his heart, but he couldn't give up on following. Shula walked towards the door. By Magnolia, as usual, took half a step back and leaned a little to the left. When they walked out of the bar, they would pass by the drunkard who was pretending to be drunk. At that moment, By Magnolia prepared 3 methods to make this person lie on the table forever. This way, he wouldn't be able to follow her, and it wouldn't attract attention. However, just as Bai Yulon's fingers danced in her sleeves, Shula took a step to the left. When she walked past the tracker who was pretending to be drunk, she seemed to have lost her balance and her left hand gently stroked the tracker's back. The drunkard's body twitched slightly, and then he fell weakly on the table. At this time, there was no need to pretend. He was unconscious, and he was truly a drunkard. Shula and By Magnolia didn't stay for a moment. They directly walked out of the bar. By Magnolia, who was walking behind them, slowly raised her head. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she looked at Shula's back with complex emotions. Just a moment ago, By Magnolia's eyes were extremely sharp. The moment Shula's hand touched the drunkard's back, a faint blue arc of electricity drilled out of Shula's sleeve. It was like a snake flashing with electric light. Except for the high-strength stun batons used by the military special forces, there were no close-range weapons that could silently knock a person out. Moreover, there wasn't the slightest burnt smell in the air, and there weren't any tears in the back of the drunkard's clothes. Magnolia looked at Shula with complex emotions. On one hand, she thought that this young technical director whom she worked so hard for had an extraordinary background. On the other hand, she was a little depressed. If she had known that Shula had such a good thing in his hands, the person in the back alley wouldn't have died according to the instructions of the person on the phone. After Shula and Magnolia left Pier number 17, they rented a car and drove directly to the Bulin district of Harbour City. Then, they rented a boat at the Riverside Stone Bridge and followed the Songhu Creek downstream. When they were about to reach the Songhu area, they abandoned the boat and went ashore. Magnolia carried the heavy black box and followed behind Shula. Suddenly, she asked, "Is the person trustworthy?" "I know the person on the phone," Shula replied. Next to a retro-style building with cornices, the two people finally saw the person who came to pick them up. Shula looked at the big man in a black suit, hung up the phone, and said with a smile, "You cooperated again." Shuen Ayin, the director of the Blackhawk Company, said with a wry smile, "Secretary Shen used to be my direct superior. I happen to be in Harbour City today. If I don't do this, who will?" Half a year ago in Linhai State, it was this retired soldier who led 3 helicopters and rescued Shula and Shi Qinghai from the Federation's pursuit. "What I want is long-term access." Shula looked at him and said seriously, "There are still 5 months before the election. I will come to Harbour City often. Temporary access to the engineering department is too troublesome." Shuen Ayin was silent for a moment and said, "This is too difficult. It is even more difficult than making a mecha. You should know that we have a certain amount of influence in the engineering department, but an existence like the Nutshell Company is not something that anyone can control alone." "I believe you." Shula shook hands with him and said sincerely. Magnolia had been silently following behind Shula. She had already recognized Shuen Ayin's identity. After all, the Blackhawk Company was also one of the 3 major security companies in the Federation. She had fought side by side with the people of Blackhawk, so of course she knew Shuen Ayin. But after hearing Shula's words, Magnolia suddenly lowered her head and smiled. It seemed that the person she was working for was not someone who only knew how to be stubborn and pedantic. She was gradually showing signs of cunning. This was good. This was not easy to die. Chapter 214. Behind every successful man, there would always be a few extremely outstanding secretaries. As the saying went, "You go to the Sea of Flowers, I go to the Sea of Fire. You go to the Parliament Mountain, I go to the Mountain of Knives. You go to the high and mighty, I will be the scapegoat, I will do the dirty things, I will be the one to pull those stupid fingers, I will be the one to kill those annoying people, and I can't let you know." This was the function of a secretary. Today, Shula was still 420 light years away from success, but he already had a secretary by his side called Bai Yulon. She was submissive but extremely useful. For a successful person like Li Xiuzhu, the young master of the Li family, the vice president of the Sanlin United Bank, he would naturally have many secretaries. Secretary Liu was the one with the highest rank and the most trusted. Secretary Liu, who was not by Li Xiuzhu's side, was an important figure in the Federation's financial world. He was a high-ranking officer in the company and had an enviable life. Today was still the summer holiday. He was on vacation with his beautiful wife and obedient daughter in the Demonstration Ecological Park in the outskirts of the capital. With a clear pond in front and a happy family in the garden behind, Secretary Liu stole half a day of leisure. He covered his face with a straw hat to block the rays of sunlight that leaked in through the bamboo canopy. The fishing rod in front of him bobbed up and down quietly on the surface of the water. He didn't care at all about the fish stealing food. A phone call disturbed his peace. Secretary Liu took off his straw hat and quietly listened to the report on the other end of the phone. His expression gradually became serious. That technical supervisor called Shula had gone to Hong Kong. The two subordinates in charge of tracking and surveillance had suddenly lost contact. They didn't know where that fellow had gone. Secretary Liu was silent for a moment. Then, he made a few more calls and arranged some things. Many days had passed since the incident at the Husk Institute's laboratory. Everyone believed that no one else would be able to know the data from the laboratory. The young master of the Li family had almost forgotten about Xu Le, but he hadn't. This was because he had discovered that Xu Le and the seventh young master had been getting closer recently. It was said that the Nutshell Engineering Department was also speeding up the development of new mecha. Now that Xu Le was going to Harbor City, what did it mean? Secretary Liu's expression was somewhat dignified, but his heart was not as solemn as he appeared to be. In his opinion, Xu Le followed Professor Shen, and perhaps he had some knowledge in the field of quantum measurable dynamics, which was why he was valued by the Nutshell Engineering Department. However, this should not affect the overall situation. The two subordinates who had lost contact with him were too far below Secretary Liu's level, so he was not worried about them. He was just wondering if this was a warning from the Tai family, the Ministry of National Defense, or the Nutshell Engineering Department. After pondering for a moment, Secretary Liu decided to leave this matter to him. He was not an ordinary secretary. No matter how big or small the matter was, he had to leave it to Li Xiuzhu to handle. He had his own authority. Most importantly, he knew that young Master Li had already boarded the family's private spaceship and was rushing to District S2 to comfort the innocent idol who had been affected by the terrorist attack. Secretary Liu knew how much the young master valued the person who had been chosen by the family, so he did not want this kind of bad news to disturb the young master's extremely angry mood. He made a phone call and gave some important instructions to his subordinates in Harbor City. Secretary Liu lay back on the bamboo chair and covered his straw hat. He listened to the laughter of his family behind him and listened to the faint sound of the fish stealing food in front of him. A satisfied smile appeared on his face, and he fell into a deep sleep. Harbor City was a huge city. Its economy was extremely developed. Especially on the large plain towards the south of the city, there were countless factory buildings. These buildings were spread out neatly on the land, and they occupied a large area. Although the Federation's heavy manufacturing industry had been gradually moved to District S2 many years ago, the foundation of the high-precision manufacturing industry was still in Jingju, in Harbor City. An inconspicuous truck left the highway and drove directly towards an industrial park. The industrial park did not have a strict gate, and there was no eye-catching name. There was only a row of large words cast on a green hill in the distance. The hill was very far away, and the row of large words was as high as a 20-story building. All of them were cast from high-strength alloys. The cold metallic luster revealed a sense of grandeur of a small world. Where there is metal, there will be fruit shells. The truck followed the spacious passage and drove at high speed in the industrial park. A plane could be faintly seen landing in the distance. That was the industrial airport of the Shell Motor Company. From the airport to the Federation's largest spaceport, Harbor City Spaceport, there was a complete transportation network formed by a dedicated road and a double-track high-speed railway. Countless resources and technical personnel from all over the Federation gathered in this huge industrial park in the southern suburbs of Harbor City through this convenient transportation. Xu Le sat in the back of the truck. He lifted the dust-proof cloth covering the window and silently looked at the huge factory building in front of him from time to time. The heavy and huge mechanical equipment in front of him could not help but be a little lost. He was one of the employees of the Shell Motor Company. It was just that in the past, he dealt with data in the Research Institute, and then he spent his days in the Whitewater Company. Today was actually the first time he had truly entered the manufacturing department of the Shell Motor Company. Only by seeing this industrial park with his own eyes could he truly feel the position of the Shell Motor Company in the Federation, and the huge power of this motor company. The automobile manufacturing business was all moved to District S2 13 constitutional calendars ago. But later, because of the increase in the cost of interplanetary travel, a part of the automobile manufacturing business was moved back to District S1. In the southwest corner is the Shell Aerospace Manufacturing Group, also known as the First Flight Bureau of the Federation. It is mainly used to manufacture aircrafts in the atmosphere. The spaceship manufacturing factory is not in Harbor City, but in Nevada. If you include the assembly base on Moon 1, the total area is slightly larger than the industrial park here in Harbor City. The civilian goods manufacturing company, which is often referred to as the Shell Motor Company, is concentrated in South Dakota. The direction of business in Harbor City is mainly cars and airplanes. About 30% of the Federation's self-made equipment is assembled in this industrial park. Jingzhou's GDP last year exceeded $5 trillion Federation dollars, ranking first among all the state-level administrative regions in the Federation, and Harbor City accounted for a share of $3.4 trillion. Of this $3.4 trillion, the Shell Motor Company provided 27% of it, which is the industrial park you see now. Bai Yulon softly played the role of a secretary. To be precise, she was originally Xu Le's secretary. The mecha manufacturing department is a top secret of the Federation. No one knows that it is also hidden in this industrial park. Bai Yulon softly said, but in fact, the Federation's secrecy measures have always been a bit of self-deception. Since the Shell Motor Company is here, the mecha will naturally be here as well. Understood. Xu Le nodded, expressing his gratitude to Bai Yulon for her explanation. During their tour, the truck drove away from the main area of the industrial park and drove inconspicuously towards an ordinary warehouse. When the truck drove into the warehouse, the rusty door immediately closed. A building that looked like an underground parking lot appeared in front of them, but the further down they went, the more unusual it felt. This underground parking lot had too many parking spaces and was too deep, but there were too few parked cars. The truck stopped, and Xu Le and Bai Yulon walked out, dragging a heavy black leather case. Xuen Aiyin, who was disguised as the truck driver, said to the two, "This is as far as I can go. Inside is a top secret of the Federation. I can't go in." Xu Le nodded and watched the truck leave. Entering the industrial park from the port city and arriving at the periphery of the engineering department seemed simple, but if it weren't for Xuen Aiyin's arrangements, he and Bai Yulon would have been stopped in the middle of the industrial park or shot to death by automatic firearms. There was no one in the dark underground parking lot. Xu Le and Bai Yulon were like two tourists who had been dropped off on a desert road. In this empty underground space, they looked lonely and helpless. Right at this moment, the sound of a freight elevator rang out beside them. After the elevator door opened, two people appeared. Xu Le walked in and extended his hand to shake Ju Yu's hand. Then, he noticed the person behind Ju Yu who looked like an official. He looked familiar, but it was fine as long as he wasn't that insincere severed finger, Supervisor Hao. "I'm Jose. We met during the spring recruitment." The freight elevator started to descend at high speed. The official in the elevator silently looked at Xu Le for a long time before he opened his mouth and said, "We haven't seen each other for a few months. I didn't expect that we would meet again under such circumstances. Your authority in the research institute has been stripped. As a third-level technical supervisor of the White Water Company, you can't enter the core area of the engineering department. Your request not only violated the internal regulations of the Shell Motor Company, but also violated the laws of the Federation." Xu Le recognized this senior supervisor of the Shell Motor Company. During the spring recruitment exam, it was this official who had interviewed him. Although the two didn't say much, Xu Le knew that the other party had always been kind to him. Therefore, he didn't mind the tone of the other party, but he didn't want to let the other party continue. "I don't want temporary authority. I want long-term authority." He looked into Jose's eyes and said seriously, "Impossible. Although the core data you provided is important, it's not enough for an important place like the engineering department to open its doors for you," said Jose. "No one knows how far the Empire's new mecha research has progressed, so the Federation needs time," said Xu Le calmly with his head lowered. "The Federal Academy of Science is already ahead of the engineering department, so you also need time. I can assure you that the Federal Academy of Science has no way to solve the problem of the electron jets. I can help you solve this problem in the shortest amount of time. So the Federation needs me, and you need me even more." The high-speed descent of the elevator gave first-timers a sense of dizziness. However, Schuler's calm speech was so clear and direct that it made Jose and Ju Yu, the HR manager of the engineering department, feel slightly dizzy. Schuler finally said, "My conditions remain the same." Chapter 215. At the beginning of autumn last year, the Federation's new generation of MX Mecha had received a devastating result in its first experiment in a real environment in the 100 Mu Triangle Star region. The Federation government, especially the military, was extremely furious at this failure. President Sieg's national security advisor had unceremoniously expressed an unusually strong and angry statement during an unexpected appearance at the Shell Motor Company board meeting. The failure of this experiment had led to many complicated consequences. Schuler's current Whitewater 7th Combat Team had become the scapegoat, and was still in a state of temporary disbandment. Meanwhile, the Nutshell Engineering Department, which had directly led the development of the new MX Mecha, had expended a large amount of the Federation's resources and wealth. They had spent more than 10 years, but in the end, they had failed miserably. Naturally, they had to bear the most pressure. It was precisely because of this reason that the senior manager of the engineering department, Jose, had appeared at the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment site. The experts within the engineering department were helpless against the interference of the wave field between the twin engines. Under this kind of pressure, manager Jose could only hope that the students from the 3 major military academies would be like newborn calves, breaking away from the Federation's traditional thinking patterns and giving himself, the Nutshell Engineering Department, and the Federation a surprise. The questions for the spring recruitment exam were all proposed by the experts of the engineering department, especially the last major question, which involved the electronic jets of the battleship's main cannons. In reality, it was precisely because the engineering department had already discovered that the fatal problem of the MX Mecha was the electronic jets in its revolutionary twin-engine design. This was an extremely targeted exam, and there were also a few examinees who performed exceptionally. For example, Ju Yu, who had now been promoted to assistant director-level engineer, Park Ji-ho, and a squatter named Schuler. However, the problem-solving ideas on these exam papers still did not give the experts of the engineering department any inspiration. Jose was somewhat disappointed, so when Professor Shun had tried to steal Schuler, he had not been too concerned. However, who would have thought that after a few months, this young man named Schuler would actually become so important? The top scientists of the Federal Academy of Science were the first to discover that the key to solving the problem of the twin engines was in the aspect of quantum measurable dynamics. The problem was that no one in the entire Federation academic community was willing to go down this dead end. For hundreds of years, the Federation academic community was completely blank in this area. Even when the Federal Academy of Science, Nutshell, Jiyu Zhong, and the most outstanding scientists of human society combined their wisdom, they were still somewhat troubled. Except for Professor Shun, who had gradually been forgotten by people. At this time, Professor Shun suddenly passed away, and the Federal Academy of Science took over all of the core data and important functions. After all, the success of the Federation's new mecha was just around the corner. In the war with the Empire, they might be able to gain the upper hand. However, what followed was a faint sense of loss. This was originally a project that the Nutshell Engineering Department had spent 10 years on, or even longer on. It was supposed to be a fruit that could shock the entire Federation. Just as it was about to be eaten, it had become a meal on someone else's plate. Start all over again? Impossible. Professor Shun had spent many years in the field of quantum measurable dynamics to calculate the core data and functions. Although the entire Federation now knew the direction of the research, how much time would it take to start all over again? Right at this time, Secretary Shun made a call using a confidential line and mentioned a person's name. That young man, through Ju Yu, continuously sent over a large amount of core data. The Nutshell Engineering Department once again had hope of success. However, they had always started a bit later than the Federal Academy of Science, and that young man had never taken out the functions outside the elevator was a long corridor. The soft light shone on the metal and high-energy plastic walls and floor, reflecting on Supervisor Jose's serious face. This was not the official entrance to the engineering department, so there were no staff passing through. Ju-yu pushed open a door on the side and led the group in. Sitting in front of the desk, Supervisor Hosei was silent for a moment before saying, "Even if you give me the functions, we will still be a bit slower than the Federal Academy of Science. Although they do not have years of experience building mechas like the engineering department, they are still a top academic institution. They can use the Federation's research ability at any time, including us." Ju-yu and Bai Yulon looked at Shula at the same time. The two of them understood Shula's personality, so when they heard Shula's calm and powerful words in the elevator earlier, they felt a bit strange. Shula placed the black leather suitcase that Bai Yulon had dragged over on the table and opened it. Inside was a workbench and some scaled-down half-metal models. There were also some unfamiliar and intricate chipsets and transmission devices that he did not know the purpose of. The Federal Academy of Science has the core data and functions, but other than that, I have a mature solution. Mature solution? Hearing these words, Supervisor Hosei and Ju-yu's faces showed extreme shock. Even Bai Yulon, who had been quietly lowering her head, slowly raised her head. She narrowed her eyes at Shula, trying to discern the truth of his words. The solution was different from the academic results obtained by Professor Shun after hiding in the small building for more than a decade. It was a realistic solution for the MX mecha. The entire Federation had tens of thousands of experts and scholars, all for the sake of the MX mecha. They had no appetite for food or drink, but they were still unable to solve this problem. Now, the Federal Academy of Science and the Engineering Department, relying on Professor Shun's precious legacy, were gradually approaching a solution. The red sun was still below the horizon, but at this moment, a 20-year-old technician who had no academic background from any famous school, who had a military background, who had only spent a few months in a research institute, said that he could solve this problem. Even though Shula had once been Professor Shun's assistant researcher, in the eyes of the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department, he had only been lucky enough to obtain the data. It did not mean that he himself had any ability. Hosei stared straight into Shula's eyes, trying to discern whether this young man was crazy, or there was just a sliver of possibility in what he said. Not to mention a mature solution, as long as a feasible idea was provided, this senior supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department would be willing to kiss the other's feet. During the spring recruitment exam, Hosei had understood Shula's ability. He knew that this was an extremely talented young engineer, but he really found it hard to believe that in just half a year, the other could transform into a person who could save the engineering department. The room was silent for a long time. Supervisor Hosei stared into Shula's eyes, then suddenly slammed the table and said in a deep voice, "Prove it." The entire Federation, Li Xiuzhu, Dean Lin, Secretary Shun, and many of the other secretaries, as well as the people from the Nutshell Engineering Department, had all underestimated Shula. Probably only Lady Tai, who had vaguely guessed something through that little blue device, believed that Shula had this kind of ability. No one knew that before Professor Shun had died, he had already begun to attempt to solve the problem of the MX mecha's twin-engine electron jets with the little kid Shula. With this Grandmaster leading the way, Shula relied on the imaginative design ability trained by Uncle Fengyu, as well as the countless blueprints bestowed upon him by that great existence in his mind. As early as several months ago, following the continuous fine-tuning of the electron beam anesthesia images on the holographic screen, the old man and the young man had long been close to success. It was not difficult to prove this point. Shula slowly and seriously entered the data on the workbench he carried with him. The 3D diagram on the holographic screen was enriched pixel by pixel, gradually taking shape. Half an hour had already passed. Shula entered the most feasible plan in his mind into the workbench, then pushed the black leather case around and placed it in front of Supervisor Hosei and Ju-yu. He lowered his head tiredly, but behind him, Bai Yulon silently raised her head. Bai Yulon was not very familiar with these cutting-edge technological achievements of the Federation, so she only stared at Supervisor Hosei and Ju-yu's expressions. Supervisor Hosei's expression was very strange, like a ball of vegetables thrown into a pot of oil. Sometimes it was green, sometimes it was black, sometimes it was fresh and tender, and sometimes it was as anxious as fire. Beside him, Juyu was not much better. The ace student of First Academy, a gentleman as gentle as jade, had an extremely strange expression right now. Shula retrieved the workbench. His index finger lightly tapped on the button, and the preliminary solution on the holographic screen instantly turned into countless dots of light and disappeared. Jose was stunned. Looking at those disappearing dots of light, it was as if the most precious existence in his life had suddenly been destroyed by someone. A heart-wrenching pain took over his entire body. He abruptly stood up, slammed the table twice, and pointed at Shula's nose. Bitterly and angrily, he scolded, "You are committing a crime." Shula lowered his head and replied, "It's still in my head. There's no need to be so anxious. The problem is, I can't confirm that this plan is effective, so I need to take a look at the MX mecha. I need an independent control room." What happened next was very simple, but also very complicated. The slightly calmer supervisor Jose used the fastest speed possible to help Shula apply for long-term access to the Nutshell Engineering Department. At his level, he still needed to go through the approval process. This process took a full 2.5 hours. There was no telling how much time had passed underground. The light was soft, and no one knew if it was already night time. After 3 scans by the scanning system, the last bits of information from the chip on the back of his neck were captured. After the authorization was confirmed, the somewhat tired Shula and his companions came to the front of an underground storeroom together. The alloy door of the storeroom slowly opened. Inside the door was an extremely large space, about 70 meters tall and at least 3,000 square meters in area. The Federation Shell Motor Company was indeed terrifying, actually having the ability to open up such a large space storeroom underground. In contrast to this spacious space, the people seemed particularly small. They boarded the self-propelled flatbed tram and followed the tracks to the deepest part of the storeroom. That was an area separated by a large, super-transparent material. Inside, there was an existence about 6 to 7 meters tall, enveloped within a large blue screen. Shula looked at that giant statue-like existence. His right hand, which was hanging by his side, could not help but clench lightly. Supervisor Jose said something into the communicator on his wrist. Above the incomparably large storeroom, the faint sound of an electric motor starting could be heard. Juyu looked at Shula's slightly nervous face beside him and could not help but pat him lightly on the shoulder. At that moment, his admiration for this ordinary-looking fellow had reached the pinnacle. Shula took a deep breath. The blue screen was slowly being pulled up. A pure white mecha gradually revealed its true appearance in front of everyone. Even though its entire body was covered in dust, and the mecha's abdomen still had terrifying scars from the explosion, that pure, even somewhat holy, whiteness still seeped out, entering everyone's eyes. Shula narrowed his eyes. At the same time that he felt a sense of awe, he could not help but feel a little strange. Why did such an important, epoch-making mecha look so wretched? Behind him, Bai Yulon also slowly raised her head at this time. She looked calmly at the mecha, but a strange feeling welled up in her heart. She was very familiar with it. Because nearly a year ago, this white, insufferably arrogant mecha had self-destructed under her control to become what it was before her eyes. Suddenly, a large amount of light blue liquid sprayed out from the roof of the storeroom. Perhaps it was not appropriate to say that it was sprayed, but it was like a rainstorm pouring down from the heavens. The light blue liquid quickly washed away the dust on the mecha's body, revealing the dazzling, cold body of the MX mecha. Like a silver knife, although its edge had been slightly dampened on a killing field, after being washed away, it was still insufferably arrogant. Chapter 216. Love at First Sight, Life Hanging by a Thread. From the moment he saw the MX mecha, Shula had fallen in love with this thing. Just like many years ago, when he had seen the beautiful lines of the B2 vacuum seam on the entrance of the cafe. This was a feeling that came from his bones, making him feel numb and itchy. The exterior of the MX Mecha was pure white. After being cleaned with a special light blue liquid, it was as smooth as a mirror. Just by looking at it with the naked eye, it could be seen that the air damping coefficient on the surface of the mecha had been reduced to the lowest possible level. The white substance was a new type of composite material. Schuler had seen the relevant records in the Husk Institute's database. This material covered the surface of the alloy in the form of extremely fine particles. The meshing was very tight. Other than the effects of resisting high temperature and radiation, it also had the bonus of weakening enemy electronic interference. On this layer of composite material, it could be recolored so that the mecha could obtain rough camouflage abilities in different environments. The surface of the MX Mecha was a combination of the most cutting-edge technological achievements of the Federation. Who knew how many dazzling designs there were for the internal power system and transmission system? The four of them stood in front of the transparent barrier, looking silently at the pure white MX Mecha. The light blue liquid slid down the smooth surface of the mecha and finally fell to the ground along the alloy mechanical legs. In an instant, it was absorbed by the absorption system on the floor of the warehouse, and not a trace of it could be seen. It was like a lotus flower after the rain, the dewdrops rolling on the green leaves and finally falling silently into the lake, giving people a sense of beauty that was quiet to the extreme. The four people present all knew that once this epoch-making mecha full of quiet beauty moved, it would become a sharp blade for the Federation, cutting through the universe that had been silent for more than 10 years. The revolutionary dual-engine design, the powerful power output, the support of speed increased by an order of magnitude. The jet main design was auxiliary, and if it was complemented by small flying wings, the mobility of the MX Mecha would reach a terrifying level never before seen before. One nail can cause the destruction of an army. Manager Jose looked up at the MX Mecha with a gentle gaze and said slowly, "One MX can change the situation of the entire universe." Schuler reluctantly retracted his gaze from the attractive surface of the mecha and glanced at Supervisor Jose. He knew that the previous sentence was a fable from the early days of the Federation. A small, insignificant detail could have far-reaching consequences that no one could have predicted. An epoch-making new mecha, in terms of military strategy, was not enough to change the balance between the Federation and the Empire. Even if the Federation were to rush production and equip the MX Mecha to the four major military regions, it did not seem to be much of a problem. However, ever since the God of War, Lees of Philadelphia, piloted an M37 mecha and assassinated His Majesty the Emperor of the Empire many years ago, the federal military's worship of mechas had reached an unprecedented level. This was not just a kind of emotional fanaticism, but because those military strategists in charge of strategic planning had suddenly discovered that as the photon energy weapons of warships gradually lost their usefulness, strategic battles on the planet and on land had to rely heavily on the fatal consequences of special operations to a large extent. This entire set of tactics was known as low-limit assault warfare. Although it was not a proper strategic advance, if it could achieve the objective of the battle, it could bring great benefits to the Federation. Unfortunately, in the entire Federation, only the God of War, Lees of Philadelphia, had the ability to carry out such a terrifying mission. Thus, the Federation could only put in effort in the performance of the mecha itself. Meanwhile, the new MX Mecha before everyone's eyes could use its super-strong performance to help the Federal military's special mecha warriors form a terrifying combat strength. It was not even limited to special operations, but could be thrown into the open battlefield. It was precisely because of this that the entire Federation had been so enraged and shaken by the failure last autumn, and why both the Academy of Science and the Engineering Department were so anxious now. Schuler understood this. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the solemn beauty of the white MX Mecha. An image naturally appeared in his mind, a special operations team formed by 30 MX Mecha, successfully breaking through the Empire's electronic surveillance network like a sharp blade, heading straight for the enemy's headquarters. However, the image in his mind quickly changed to that of a lone MX Mecha. In the spacious charter square of the Federation capital, in the eyes of countless people, it had turned into a stream of light. Like a knife, it had broken through the defensive perimeter of the Federation military and police, the tip of the knife pointing directly at a white-haired politician. He did not know why this image had suddenly appeared in his mind. "Fix this knife, and the entire Federation will be grateful to you." Jose glanced at Shula with a complicated expression, and then patted his shoulder lightly. Shula entered the Nutshell Engineering Department to help redesign the Z4 electronic jet. All of this was carried out under absolute secrecy. In order to maintain secrecy, although the Nutshell Engineering Department had secretly granted Shula long-term access of the 14 MX Mecha prototypes, they could only provide him with the one that had exploded in the Bermuda Triangle star region. At the same time, Jose had given Shula a spare top-secret workshop for him to use, and it was precisely this large warehouse they were currently in. The transparent barrier had already been removed. Shula connected his black leather case to the central control computer in the warehouse, and then began his own work on the workbench. He did not lament about anything, nor did he waste any time, immediately starting work. Behind the large metal wall, a bracket held the white MX Mecha's large body in place, and 3 large automatic maintenance robotic arms reached out from behind the wall. Due to the explosion of the twin engines, the power output of this half-abandoned prototype was completely dependent on the high-voltage power source behind the wall. Bai Yulon stood silently behind Shula the entire time. Occasionally, she would lower her head to glance at the complicated blueprints and command inputs on the screen of the workbench. Occasionally, she would raise her head to watch that MX Mecha perform some very rigid movements under the command of the data commands. The external controls needed to avoid the central control chipset of the mecha, and the data commands needed to be matched, so the MX Mecha's movements were clearly not smooth. This was only the initial stage of testing. Bai Yulon's hands, which were usually tucked in his trousers, were now pulled out and quietly placed behind his back. Right now, he felt like he was back when he had first joined the army, standing behind the colonel and playing the role of a competent orderly. He had an illusion that this large and solemn white mecha was like a puppet toy in front of Shula's eyes. There were many strings attached to it, and the ends of those strings were all in Shula's palm. As long as Shula was willing, he could bring this white mecha to life at any time. After who knew how long? A loud mechanical sound rang out. In the corner of the spacious warehouse, a semi-sealed passageway opened up. The automatic assembly line began to move, and the mechanical arms began to assemble themselves. An automatic equipment control room for the design of electronic jets began to take shape. After lowering his head for a long time, Shula finally raised his head. After this period of testing and research, he finally had a rough understanding of the internal structure of the MX Mecha. In the past, when he was in the research lab, he had been amazed by the beautiful design of the twin engines. Today, in the internal computer of the engineering department, he saw even more of the MX Mecha's marvelous design and genius structure. His heart was once again shaken. He left the workbench and walked to the bottom of the MX Mecha. Reaching out, he gently patted the cold alloy tracks of the mecha and narrowed his eyes. Now, in his eyes, the MX Mecha's metallic white armor had all been stripped away. It was like a naked young girl, a little shy, a little angry, but the fine hairs were all there, fair and delicate and enchanting. There was no external appearance, only those complicated internal power output devices, alloy spherical joints, the genius design of the twin engines, and those densely packed circuits and chipsets. But it was precisely this that made it even more beautiful. In the 10-odd years since Professor Shun had entered the building, Shula had also worked diligently for 2 whole days and 2 nights in the spare warehouse of the engineering department. In these dozens of hours, he had not rested for a single minute. His food and water had all been brought to him by Magnolia. He had not seen it with his own eyes, but he knew that behind the mecha, behind the thick walls, there were many extremely professional and respectable engineers in the Nutshell Engineering Department. They were busy as he was, according to his requests, preparing all kinds of data, as well as parts and semi-finished products that were continuously sent over through the semi-sealed assembly line. Shula was a man, not a god. He would never be able to complete all the changes to the powertrain system of the Federation's new MX Mecha on his own. Fortunately, He now had the support of the most experienced group of engineers in the Federation, although those engineers might never know who the designer they were currently assisting was. There was a glass bridge above the top-secret operation room in the Nutshell Engineering Department. Supervisor Jose was holding a cup of coffee. Through the transparent material under his feet, he looked at the engineers who were working in silence. He watched as they drank coffee, crossed their legs, cursed, sometimes exclaimed, and sometimes frowned. Schuler had provided a solution. To complete this solution, he still needed these subordinates of his. Supervisor Jose narrowed his eyes. He knew that his subordinates, with their keen sense of smell, must have noticed that the atmosphere of the entire engineering department was different. They must have noticed that the MX research and development work that had stopped for a long time was progressing at an unimaginable speed in a certain corner of the engineering department. Juyu walked to his side. Looking at those nervous engineers below, he said softly, "According to the results of the calculations, Schuler's design is correct. Moreover, his modification of the powertrain system also did not affect the balance of the MX mecha itself." Jose raised his cup of coffee and took a sip. He had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights. Although he was tired, he was also somewhat excited, so much so that his 2 dark circles were shining brightly. "I have to admit that he is a genius." After a long silence, Juyu suddenly smiled and said, "If MX can be successfully developed within this year, I would like to apply for a transfer out of the engineering department." Supervisor Jose frowned at him. He had personally recruited Juyu into the engineering department, so he naturally thought highly of him. Moreover, Juyu was also a talent that the madam had prepared for the future. He did not understand why Juyu would suddenly want to apply for a transfer. "Where do you plan to transfer to?" "The 1st Military Region's Special Mecha Team has wanted me since 2 years ago," said Juyu. Jose looked at him, and after a moment of silence, said, "With your mecha combat skills, if you wanted to go, you would have gone long ago." "Why now?" "I've always thought that I'm pretty good at operating and understanding mecha," said Juyu with a smile. "That's why I've always been shifting between these 2 directions. These past 2 days, you've been supervising the cooperation of your colleagues in the engineering department, while I've been keeping an eye on Schuler and that secretary Bai." After a moment's silence, Juyu said, "After watching Schuler for 2 days and 2 nights, I can't help but feel a little crestfallen. He didn't graduate from a military academy, so he probably hasn't touched the MX mecha before. But right from the start, he acted as if he had grown up in mecha, whether it was his vision or his problem-solving thinking, as well as those lines of thought that I don't know how he figured them out. It all proves that he has already left me in the dust. Is there really such a thing as talent in mecha mechanics? I didn't believe it before, but now I have to believe it." Juyu sighed. Looking at those nervous colleagues working below the transparent glass stack, he said, "The difference between people is really too big." Manager Jose was silent for a long time, and then shook his head with a wry smile. "Don't compare yourself to a freak. That will indeed hurt your self-confidence. Bearing the task of developing the Federation's new mecha while also competing with those old fellows from the Federal Academy of Science for time, these top engineers in the Nutshell Engineering Department naturally did not have any summer holidays. However, it was inevitable that they would feel a little unhappy. However, when they found that the task assigned to them by the Chief Technical Control Department, these talents with IQs above 170 all noticed something strange. What they were doing was providing technical support. According to a request from some sort of warehouse in the engineering department, they were responsible for providing data models and performing massive amounts of calculations. What shocked them the most was that after they provided relevant reference opinions, the other party's feedback would come extremely quickly. In the blink of an eye, a completely different blueprint would be provided. The engineers were all stunned. They thought that even those arrogant fellows in the Husk Institute would not be able to make such a correct response in such a short amount of time. For a moment, they actually felt a faint sense of admiration for that mysterious engineering participant. Of course, they did not know that in the empty warehouse not far away, there was only a lonely young technician working hard. Otherwise, they would definitely be like Jose and Juyu, seeing the other party as a freak. Juyu leaned forward on the handrail of the transparent glass stack. Looking at the busy engineering department, he thought about the lonely figure in the empty warehouse not far away. His expression was a little complicated. He sighed and said, "I have a very childish, naive, and impulsive idea. Is it possible to give that kid a hammer and add a few tons of scrap metal? He can also build a mecha." Chapter 217. To be able to use a rusty hammer to smash dozens of tons of scrap metal and create a shiny mecha with rainbow clouds floating on top of it, this kind of person was the creator, not Schuler. Schuler had also swung the peace axe in the Nutshell laboratory. He had also found a mecha central control chip in the garbage in the Donglin district. However, he was still only one person. However, Juyu's sigh was not entirely wrong. After all, Schuler was indeed a freak. 2 years ago, when he was escaping from the Donglin district, he was able to repair an M01 mecha from the early 37th century era by relying on simple tools and broken household electrical components in the ancient Bell's waste storage compartment. Although the mecha had only taken one step before it broke into countless parts, almost smashing into the cute little watermelon, it at least proved that Schuler had a natural talent for machinery. This talent had long been recognized by Uncle Feng Yu. Schuler from the Donglin district only had a bold and imaginative idea in the field of mechanical repair and the basic skills that he had trained day after day. In the past 2 years, he had studied all the Federation's M37 series mecha blueprints seriously in Section H of the Ua University Library. He had also studied the prototype mecha in Section H1 without rest. At that time, he was already able to use the blueprints in the bracelet to create a small device that could hide from the blue light of the glory of the charter. He was also able to modify the antique simulation system. After entering the Husk Institute, under the guidance of Professor Shen, he was also able to familiarize himself with the theoretical knowledge in the huge and complex database. Most importantly, his mind was filled with countless strange blueprints. Although they were not necessarily practical, the designs were ingenious and were definitely above the Federation's standard. So many opportunities, so many hard-working studies, and his natural talent combined to turn an orphan into the freak that shocked the entire Nutshell engineering department. The huge white mecha's body was no longer as solemn and dignified as it used to be. 3 huge automatic mechanical maintenance arms moved slowly and precisely. Accompanied by the low sound of motors rotating, the sound of fasteners coming off, and the fine sound of electric welding, countless components were removed, and new components were reassembled. The joint transmission device was rerouted, and the hidden weapon system was placed on the operating table like the bleeding internal organs of an animal, and it was disregarded by the people. The alloy armor covering the white composite material had already been completely removed, and the large, high-strength frame was exposed to the air. The left half of the MX mecha looked as though it had been hollowed out, looking somewhat terrifying and awkward. The entire MX mecha was now like a giant zombie emperor from the legends, wearing tattered clothes and carrying a heavy, rusty hammer. It seemed as though flesh and blood would fall with every step it took. Schuler raised his head and looked away from the rapidly flashing instructions on the workbench, as well as the technical data sent back by the Nutshell engineering department. He took out a bottle of eye drops from the black leather case and carefully dripped a few drops into his eyes. He closed his eyes and rested for a while. He quickly walked to the front of the operating table and looked up at the MX mecha that had been disassembled by the mechanical arms he controlled. He turned around and whispered something to Bai Yulon. He thought silently for a moment. Then, he climbed up the paved stairs on the side. His movements were very nimble. He only used a few seconds to climb to the midsection of the MX mecha. He carefully passed through the tool head at the front of the giant mechanical arms and stood in the original position of the operating cabin. He looked at the exposed data port and turned around to pat the balance meter hard. Jumping down from the MX mecha, Schuler looked at Bai Yulon and shook his head. Then, he walked back to the work table. Repairing mecha was actually no different from repairing home appliances. This was what Uncle Feng Yu had once said. It was difficult to maintain the humidity and temperature in this backup operating room. The level of dust control was also not high enough. However, Shula did not care about these things. When military mecha were to be placed on the battlefield in the future, they would have to face a harsh and complex environment that was much harsher than the current one. After applying a few more drops of eye drops and rubbing his eyes, Shula once again walked to Bai Yulon's side. He asked her a few questions and then carefully entered his own commands on the work table. The mechanical arms began to work. The busy engineers not far away also began to work hard at his occasional thought. If this had been the standard M-series mecha of the Federation, Shula might have finished his work long ago. However, the MX before him was a completely new design. It contained the hard work of countless scientists and engineers over the past decade or so. A mecha was a whole. If he wanted to change the design of the Z4 electronic jet, it would definitely affect the design of the twin engines. In turn, it would change the entire internal structure of the mecha. Shula did not dare to touch the hard work of the engineers over the past decade. However, he had to admit that the collective wisdom of a group was always so dazzling. Even if he wanted to change it, he would not be able to do so. Thus, he took a different route. With the help of the engineers in charge of developing the MX, he changed the non-core system of the MX to match the new Z4 electronic jet he had designed. Modifying the mecha and redesigning the Z4 electronic jet were two aspects that had to be done simultaneously to complete the Federation's new mecha. When the twin engines were operating at full power, the electronic jet would cause severe deviations in its tracks. Shula wanted to solve this problem. Luckily, he had Bai Yulon's secretary by his side. This delicate man was one of the few people in the Federation who had personally piloted the MX. He was also the only one who had exploded the MX. With the pilot's first-hand information and his own experience, Shula's new design had become much easier and easier to handle. Day did not know the darkness of night. Shula did not know either. He did not know how long he had been working in this spacious underground warehouse. He did not feel tired. Instead, he felt slightly excited. Metal, engine oil, these were the most common things. However, they were still used on the newest mecha. The faint smell made him feel very familiar. It was as if he had returned to the control room in the mine. The first step of the work had been completed. Shula looked at the MX mecha that was still in a terrible state. A sense of satisfaction and pride rose in his heart. He narrowed his eyes, put his hands on his hips, raised his head, and looked at the mecha without moving. A bunch of 5-star knives and other similar tools swung continuously behind his hips. They made a sound like wind chimes. Gradually, they stopped. There was still a long way to go before the final success. Bai Yulon did not need to act as a test pilot now. Thus, in between Shula's hard work, when he did not need to provide pilot advice, he would lean against the chair and sleep for a while. Awoken by the clanging of metal, Bai Yulon quietly looked at Shula's back. She looked at the huge figure of the alloy mecha in front of Shula. She looked at the bunch of metal objects hanging behind Shula's hips. Her feelings were complicated. She did not know where Shula had found this bunch of metal tools. These tools clearly could not be used on the MX, but he had hung them behind his hips, swinging awkwardly. Shula put his hands on his hips and tilted his head back as much as he could. He was like a little boy who had just woken up. He looked at the mecha happily. Listening to the clanging behind him, he thought of the uncle who had led him on this path. You can at least stay and help Shula test the mecha. He may be a freak in the field of mecha mechanics, but at least in the field of mecha piloting, not many people can beat you. On the glass bridge, Supervisor Jose comforted Ju Yu. Ju Yu laughed bitterly and said, "The delicate man Shula brought along is called Bai Yulon. He was the original battle supervisor of Whitewater Company's Team 7. The scrapped MX they are currently modifying was scrapped by him." Jose was slightly taken aback but did not say anything more. A pilot who could be selected by the federal military to carry out the Bermuda MX experiment mission was undoubtedly extremely outstanding. Since Schuler had brought Bai Yulon along and helped him get temporary authority, it was naturally to prepare for the test in the future. The two of them left the engineering department and came to that spacious storeroom. Even though he had mentally prepared himself, when he saw the MX mecha that had been dismantled to pieces, Supervisor Jose could not help but feel a pang of heartache, even though he knew that his heartache was very unjustified. "You're a freak," Jose said to Schuler with a smile, "and in the future, the entire Federation will know this." Schuler smiled and did not refute this assessment. He said, "The first step of the work has been completed. I will probably be leaving Hong Kong soon. Are you not going to stay? If you're worried about the other side, I have many ways to transfer you to the engineering department through proper channels." Supervisor Jose looked at him sternly. They were both from the Shell Motor Company, so even the CEO of Whitewater had to respect his authority as the HR supervisor of the engineering department. What he did not understand was why Schuler wanted to leave when the MX modification work was already underway. The modification plan still needs to be continuously revised. The main technical design and calculation work will still be done by the colleagues in the engineering department. Schuler replied, "During this period of time, there is no use for me to stay here. If there are any problems, you can contact me directly." Jose understood that what he said made sense. Today's task was only the preliminary design. To perfect this work, hundreds of engineers in the engineering department would still need to work around the clock. During this period of time, it did not matter whether Schuler was here or not. But subconsciously, Jose did not want to let Schuler leave. He only looked at this young man's calm but determined expression, so he did not say anything. Bai Yulon frowned slightly. She guessed that Schuler was probably stalling for time, but why was he stalling? Supervisor Jose did not notice anything unusual, but he felt it. Schuler glanced at him. If the Nutshell Engineering Department was the first to successfully develop the MX mecha, it would undoubtedly be a harsh slap to the faces of the bunch of old men at the Federation's Academy of Sciences. The Nutshell Mobility Company, which had been sullen for almost a year, would definitely be able to hold their heads up high. The person who created the MX mecha would be involved in the presidential election. The contrast between the influence of Senator Parbray's side and that of Senator Ross Macklin's side would cause the Federal Academy of Science to be pushed back, breaking the secret agreement between the two sides. That dean surnamed Lin would probably not stand up to support Macklin's side in spite of his anger. But to Schuler, this kind of ending was far from enough. He treated this world kindly, but if anyone in the Federation crossed his bottom line, he would hold a grudge. For example, Macklin and Dean Lin were both his targets. Although they were high up and extremely far away from him, he believed in the power of technology. When the Federal Academy of Science successfully developed the MX mecha according to the core data and functional formulas in the laboratory and announced it to the public, Schuler really wanted to see how embarrassed Professor Shen, who had relied on plagiarism and trickery to stand at the top of the Federation's academic circle, would be. Schuler did not tell anyone about the tampering with the data in the laboratory. He felt that Bai Yulon had guessed something, but he did not explain. He only raised the wine glass in his hand and said, "I'm still not used to this kind of situation." They were currently at the Ivy Club in the Peninsula Hotel's annex building, in the middle of a semi-formal cocktail party. The soft and almost inaudible music, the large tasseled curtains by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the exquisite delicacies on the straight tables that had lost their original flavor, and the elegant smiles of the upper class wearing formal wear made Schuler and Bai Yulon, who were both orphans, feel uncomfortable. Secretary Bai loved money and enjoyment, but he definitely did not think that this sort of cocktail party was a form of enjoyment. He calmly stood one step behind Schuler and said softly, "If they knew how important you are to the Nutshell mecha, they would definitely throw themselves at you." It was unknown which important figure had organized this cocktail party, but Supervisor Jose had brought Schuler and Bai Yulon here. After a round of introductions, Hosei and Juyu had been pulled away, so naturally, no one would notice Shula and Bai Yulon in the corner. In order to cover up the real purpose of Shula's visit to Hong Kong, Hosei had brought him to this kind of social event to show that the Nutshell Mecha engineering department valued him. People would naturally notice this. On top of the truth, there was a layer of truth, and people would often treat the layer of truth as a lie. Supervisor Hosei's understanding of people's hearts had indeed reached a very admirable level. Today, you have talked to me more. Shula looked at Bai Yulon with a smile. Your mood is also much better than the other day. Bai Yulon slightly lowered her eyes and replied in a subordinate's tone, I believe that if I follow you, there will be money to be made, so I naturally have to be more sincere. Shula's surroundings were quiet, but Supervisor Hosei and Juyu, who were at the center of the party, were surrounded by a lot of people. The identity of the supervisor of the Shell Motor Corporation engineering department was enough to allow Hosei to face any important figure in the Federation. And those guests also knew Juyu's background. Although his family was poor, he was a top student from a college, and was highly valued by the Nutshell Mecha engineering department. His future was limitless. In the 67th year, which was the most expensive year, people were naturally willing to have more emotional exchanges at this time. Listening to the kind and polite praise in the words, Juyu lowered his head and laughed at himself. He subconsciously looked at Shula in the corner of the party, and thought that compared to this young man, he was not qualified to be proud. His eyes swept over, but he saw a girl walking over there. He could not help but feel a little surprised. Slightly nervous, Nan Xiangmei, whose beautiful and dignified face was a little rosy, walked in front of Shula in small steps. Shula looked at her thick black hair that was slightly curled at the end. He could not help but be a little surprised, and immediately said with a sincere smile, Hello. I am 500 votes away from Old Duan, but Tudu is only a little more than 100 votes away from me. Ah, it's exploding. Why is the situation even more tense? I am ashamed. I will send another 2,000 words later. What am I trying so hard for? It's the monthly votes in your hand. If you vote tomorrow and vote at the end of the month, why don't you vote now? Jiao, Nan Xiangmei. Chapter 218. The Summer Fire Festival was also known as the July Fire Festival. According to ancient customs, passionate men and women would confide in each other during these passionate nights. This custom gradually faded in the history of the Federation, but it was still maintained in some states of the S3 region. After seeing off her good friend Miao Miao at the spaceport, Nan Xiangmei felt a little sad about the separation. In order to calm her emotions, she toured the city for several days. She also stayed at the Peninsula Hotel, but because Shula was hiding under the Shell Motor Company these days, the two naturally couldn't see each other. Nan Xiangmei didn't want to attend this banquet because her family had always been low-key. Unlike the Tai family, who judged the situation and kept a low profile, Nan Xiangmei's family had always been strict and rarely allowed their children to appear in public. But this time, for some reason, her father called her and told her to attend this banquet, but didn't explain the reason. Nan Xiangmei's character was like her dignified and beautiful facial features. She followed the rules, was quiet and peaceful, and naturally wouldn't go against her father's wishes. So she came to the banquet and attracted a lot of attention. Her own eyes were attracted by Shula. Shula was definitely not handsome, but his small eyes and the sincere smile that often hung on his face were somewhat attractive. But for some reason, after that night on the high-speed train, Nan Xiangmei still remembered this boy whose name she didn't even know. That amazing person from the Lin family told her on the train that her marriage with Do Hai was terminated. Nan Xiangmei couldn't help but feel relaxed. For the first time in her life, she seemed to be able to arrange her own life. Her heart that was restrained by a strict family actually yearned for the romance that young girls love. Perhaps it was because of the July wildfire, Or perhaps it was because when she was qualified to seek romance, Shula happened to sit beside her and even gave her a hand. So for no reason, Nan Xiangmei had a deep impression of this man with small eyes. Originally, she thought that there was no possibility of seeing him again after they parted, so she was a little lost. But tonight, they met again at the banquet. Is this called fate? Nan Xiangmei thought nervously, and then suddenly appeared in front of Shula. She lowered her head slightly and replied softly, "Hello." Then she looked up and asked seriously, "May I know your name?" Nan Xiangmei was a typical two-eyed beauty. Her face was not very eye-catching, and she was not as cool as Zhu Yu. However, her dignified and beautiful eyebrows and her thick black hair made people feel very comfortable. Shula, who had lived under the same roof as the daughter of the Zhu family for so many days, naturally had a strong resistance to beautiful women. However, he had to admit that the girl in front of him was really outstanding. After hearing this brave question, he was stunned and lowered his head and said, "My name is Shula." Shula wondered if Park Ji-ho's widow had said her name while crying. Shula thought to himself with mixed feelings. Nan Xiangmei slightly tilted her head and frowned in confusion. She felt that the name was familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had heard it. At this time, Bai Yulon had already retreated to a distance. As a secretary, she thought that Shula would like her presence in this kind of situation. After Shula and Nan Xiangmei exchanged names, they suddenly didn't know what to say. After a somewhat awkward silence, Nan Xiangmei plucked up her courage and said seriously, "Mr. Shu, where do you work?" This very formal tone made Shula stunned. He was not used to it, so he scratched his head and laughed. Nan Xiangmei couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Her family was so strict that it was even a little rigid. There were not many opportunities for her to talk casually with the opposite sex except for Do Hai. She didn't expect that the person in front of her named Shula would have the same stiff reaction as her. Just as Shula was about to answer, suddenly there was a sound of footsteps. A figure directly walked past him and rudely bumped into his shoulder. Then, with a few people who looked like attendants, they rudely stood between him and Nan Xiangmei. That person smiled and said something to Nan Xiangmei, then turned around and looked at Shula indifferently. The person who came was a young man. He was wearing a light blue suit made of light linen and excellent tailoring. It gave the casual summer style of a formal suit. It was particularly suitable for him to appear in this high-class banquet. Even the somewhat frivolous light blue suit didn't cause any discomfort at this moment. "Do Hai." Nan Xiangmei was a little displeased, but she still kept her calm voice. She didn't want this person to misunderstand anything, because she was very clear about how terrible the family behind this young man was. Although they were in a banquet, the cultivation of an aristocratic family wouldn't let him do anything immediately, but if Shula didn't have enough vigilance and really offended this person, she would feel very guilty. "I am Nan Xiangmei's fiancé, Lin Do Hai." "Who are you?" Lin Do Hai looked at Shula. The meaning of this sentence was very ordinary, but the direct sentence revealed a sense of unpleasantness. Hearing the two words Do Hai, Shula thought of the words that the man on the high-speed train said to Nan Xiangmei. He knew that the other party must have an unusual relationship with Nan Xiangmei. He was prepared to forget about the previous impolite bump, but he didn't expect that the other party didn't have the intention to keep the peace. "The children of the 7 great families I know are generally more polite." Shula looked at Lin Do Hai and said with a smile. The 7 great families, in the hearts of ordinary Federation citizens, were distant and unreachable existences. They would subconsciously respect or lower their heads, but that didn't include Shula. He washed the hair of the little princess of the Zhong family, took the Tai family's young master to have sex, and watched the little stars dance with the Li family's 7th child. In front of him, the 7 great families didn't have the slightest sense of mystery. On the contrary, because of his many past experiences, he was used to silent and smiling, and he rarely gave these children of the 7 great families. Lin Do Hai, so he was a child of the Lin family. So what? Although the Do Hai was vast, it was still not as real as the mountain. Hearing Shula's words, Lin Do-hai's expression changed slightly. Nan Xiangmei was also a little surprised. Both of them didn't expect that this small-eyed man seemed to know their family background from the beginning. At this moment, the phone in Shula's clothes suddenly rang. After answering the phone, his expression changed slightly. After a while, he slowly relaxed and asked nervously, "It's good that you're fine. Why did you bring it forward? I'll be right back." After hurriedly saying these 3 sentences, Shula nodded to Nan Xiangmei as a sign of respect. Without even looking at Lin Do-hai, he walked to the center of the banquet and pulled Juyu out of the crowd. After whispering a few words to him, he quickly left the banquet. Secretary Bai, who was usually quiet and silent, quietly followed behind him. She felt a little strange. Even when entering the core area of the engineering department, Shula didn't seem to be so excited and nervous. Who was on the other end of the phone, and what did they say? Lin Do-hai looked at the leaving figure and listened to the attendant's words. He couldn't help but feel angry. The children of the aristocratic families were naturally well-mannered, but the other party was just a third-level technical supervisor. Coupled with the previous scene, it was difficult for him to accept that the other party just left. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.